The rain had started long before Evelyn Carter noticed it. It crept in quietly, the way things always did when they intended to stay. Not the dramatic kind that demanded umbrellas or sent people running for cover, but the steady, patient rain that soaked through clothes, through schedules, through resolve. It softened the city's edges, blurred streetlights into halos, and turned the night into something muted and reflective. Evelyn sat in the back seat of her car, watching droplets chase each other down the tinted window. She checked her watch. 6:43. The driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror, waiting for instruction. He had been trained to wait. Everyone around Evelyn was trained to wait. Assistants, executives, legal teams, entire rooms of people who paused until she decided which direction time would move next. "Give me a minute," she said. "Yes, ma'am." The restaurant was right there, 30 steps at most. A modest place tucked between a dry cleaner and a bookstore that had gone out of business years ago but still kept its sign up, as if refusing to admit defeat. A blind date. The phrase felt foreign in her mind, like something borrowed from a life she didn't recognize as her own. Evelyn Carter did not do blind dates. She did not do uncertainty or coincidence, or anything that relied on trust before verification. Her world ran on preparation, on leverage, on information gathered long before decisions were made. If she walked into a room, she already knew who held power, who wanted it, and who would fold under pressure. This situation offered none of that. She knew only a name: Daniel, a single father, a widower. That was it. Her therapist had suggested it carefully, weeks earlier, as if placing a fragile object on the table between them. "One dinner," she'd said. No titles, no expectations, just presence. Evelyn had stared at her, expression unreadable, then nodded once. And now here she was. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the faint hum of the city through the seat beneath her. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded. Life continued, indifferent to her hesitation. She opened the door and stepped out into the rain. It kissed her face immediately, cool and insistent. She didn't rush, didn't run. Her heels clicked against the wet pavement as she crossed the short distance to the restaurant, each step deliberate, grounding. The bell above the door chimed softly when she entered. Warmth enveloped her, real warmth, not the curated sterility of luxury spaces. The smell of coffee, fresh bread, and something sweet drifted through the air. Conversations murmured at low volume, unpolished and unhurried. No one looked up, no heads turned, no recognition flickered across faces. Evelyn paused, startled by the absence of reaction. For years, her presence had altered rooms. Voices softened or sharpened. Eyes followed. People adjusted their posture without realizing why. Here, she was invisible. And, strangely, it felt like relief. She scanned the room. Only a handful of tables were occupied. A couple leaned close together, speaking in quiet intensity. An older man read a newspaper, glasses perched low on his nose. Near the window, a man sat alone, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, his gaze fixed on the rain streaking down the glass. Something about him felt still. Not passive, just settled, as if he had learned how to exist in pauses. He looked up. Their eyes met. He stood immediately, almost too quickly, knocking his knee against the edge of the table. He winced, then laughed softly at himself, an embarrassed sound that held no self-pity. "Evelyn?" he asked. His voice wasn't polished. It wasn't unsure either. It was careful, like someone used to weighing words before releasing them. "Yes," she replied. "Daniel." He nodded, relief flickering across his face. "That's me." He pulled out the chair across from him before she could do it herself. The movement wasn't theatrical. It was reflexive, ingrained, like a habit formed long before this night. "Thank you for coming," he said as she sat. "I wasn't sure if." "I almost didn't," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. He smiled at that. Not wide, not charming, just genuine. "Me too." They sat for a moment without speaking. The silence wasn't awkward. It simply existed, unfilled and unjudged. Rain tapped steadily against the window beside them, punctuating the quiet like a slow heartbeat. Up close, Evelyn noticed details she wouldn't have caught from across the room. His jacket was clean but worn thin at the cuffs. His hands were rough, the skin dry and cracked, marked by work that didn't stop when it became inconvenient. His face held lines that spoke less of age and more of responsibility, of years spent bracing rather than drifting. "What would you like?" he asked. "Whatever you're having," she said. He nodded once. "Coffee's good here. Strong, honest." She lifted an eyebrow. "Honest coffee." He chuckled quietly. "It doesn't pretend to be something it's not." The barista brought her cup without comment. No recognition, no whispered name. Just a mug placed gently on the table, steam curling upward. Evelyn took a sip. It was good, rich, uncomplicated. They talked slowly at first, about the rain, about the neighborhood, about how the restaurant stayed open late because the owner believed people needed somewhere warm after long days. Daniel didn't ask her what she did. She noticed that immediately. Most people asked within minutes, curiosity sharpened by calculation. But he didn't. He asked where she grew up, what music she listened to when she was tired, whether she preferred mornings or nights. "Nights," she said without hesitation. "They expect less of you." He smiled faintly. "I understand that." After a while, she asked him, "What do you do, Daniel?" He didn't pause, didn't brace. "I work nights," he said. "Janitorial services, office buildings downtown." No apology followed, no self-deprecating joke. Just the truth, offered plainly. "That's late hours?" she said. He nodded. "It is, but it pays, and it's quiet." "Why quiet?" she asked. His fingers tightened slightly around his mug. Not enough to be defensive, just enough to be honest. "Because during the day," he said slowly, "everything asks something from you. At night, you can just exist without explaining yourself." The words settled in her chest like something long overdue. "Do you live nearby?" she asked. "Yes," he replied, "with my son." Her breath caught before she could stop it. "How old?" "6, he said, and his expression softened instantly. "Matteo. And his mother?" she asked gently. Daniel's gaze dropped to the table. "She passed away 3 years ago," he said. "Cancer." It moved fast. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said, and the words felt fragile but necessary. He nodded once. "Thank you." Silence stretched again, heavier this time. Outside, the rain deepened, drumming more insistently against the glass. "I didn't think I'd come tonight," Daniel said eventually. "My neighbor is watching Matteo. I don't like being away too long." "But you came," Evelyn said. "Yes," he replied. "Because my life has been very small lately, and sometimes you have to step outside it to remember it can be bigger." The truth of it hit her harder than she expected. They talked longer than either had planned. About loss, about exhaustion, about the strange loneliness that came from being surrounded by people and still feeling unseen. Evelyn didn't tell him she was a CEO. She didn't tell him about the boardrooms, the shareholders, the invisible weight of power she carried. For once, she wanted to be known without context. When they stood to leave, the rain had softened but not stopped. Daniel offered his jacket without thinking. She smiled and shook her head. "I'm okay." He looked slightly embarrassed. "Habit." Outside, they stood beneath the awning, the city humming around them. "I enjoyed tonight," he said. No expectations, just honesty. "So did I," she replied. They exchanged numbers. No promises, no pressure. As Evelyn walked back toward her car, she glanced once over her shoulder. Daniel was still standing there, watching the rain, hands in his pockets, like someone who had learned how to wait without resentment. She didn't know it yet, but the quiet man she'd just met would soon stand between her and the collapse of everything she had built. And Daniel didn't know that the woman he'd shared coffee with was days away from losing the only identity she thought protected her. The rain kept falling. Unaware of the storm it was about to become, Evelyn Carter did not check her phone until she was halfway home. The car moved smoothly through wet streets, windshield wipers marking time in steady arcs. The city looked different through rain, less aggressive, less demanding. Neon signs blurred into soft color. Traffic slowed, as if even the roads had decided to breathe. She sat back against the seat and exhaled. Only then did she realize how tightly she had been holding herself together. Her phone buzzed once in her hand. A calendar alert she'd forgotten to dismiss. Another buzz followed. An assistant checking in about the morning schedule. She silenced it without reading. Her mind was still at the cafe, at Daniel. At the way he'd listened without trying to solve her. At how he hadn't once asked her what she did, or what she was worth, or whether knowing her could benefit him. She was unused to that kind of neutrality. People either wanted something from her or were intimidated by what they assumed she could take from them. Daniel had wanted nothing. That unsettled her more than ambition ever had. She glanced down at the number saved in her phone. Daniel R. No title, no annotation, just a name. By the time she reached her building, the rain had slowed to a mist. The doorman greeted her by name, professional and respectful. The elevator ride-up was silent, mirrored walls reflecting a woman who looked composed and untouchable. The illusion snapped the moment she stepped into her penthouse. The space was immaculate. Too immaculate. Everything in its place, nothing out of order, nothing that suggested a life unfolding rather than being managed. The city stretched endlessly beyond the floor, to ceiling windows, impressive and distant. Evelyn set her purse down and leaned against the kitchen counter. She replayed the evening in fragments. Daniel's laugh when he knocked his knee against the table, the way his voice softened when he said his son's name. The absence of performance. She poured herself a glass of water, then another, as if grounding herself in the act of doing something ordinary. This was ridiculous, she told herself. It was one dinner. Still, when she lay down that night, sleep did not come easily. Daniel Reyes stood at his kitchen sink, staring at nothing. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of rain against the window. Mateo slept in the next room, curled around his favorite blanket, breathing slow and even. Daniel washed the same mug twice before realizing it. He set it aside and dried his hands, resting them on the counter. The date had gone better than he expected. That, too, unsettled him. He had spent most of the day debating whether to cancel. Every reason to stay home had lined up neatly in his head. Mateo had a test coming up, money was tight. Tomorrow was an early night shift. But beneath all of it sat the real reason, heavy and unspoken. He was tired of disappointment. Still, he had gone, and now he couldn't stop thinking about Evelyn Carter. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, in a composed, understated way, but because she had listened, really listened. Not politely, not strategically, but with the kind of attention that suggested curiosity rather than assessment. She hadn't flinched when he told her what he did, hadn't tried to reassure him or reframe it. She'd simply accepted it. That mattered more than he wanted to admit. He glanced toward Mateo's room, a familiar ache tightening in his chest. Every choice he made now had to pass through the filter of fatherhood. Risk wasn't romantic anymore. It was irresponsible. Evelyn felt like risk. And yet, he shook his head, shutting off the kitchen light. It was one dinner. The next morning arrived without ceremony. Evelyn's alarm went off at 5:30. She was already awake. She moved through her routine automatically. Shower, tailored suit, hair pinned neatly in place. By the time she stepped into the elevator, the woman from the cafe was nowhere to be found. By 8, she was seated at the head of a long conference table, reviewing quarterly projections while executives spoke in carefully modulated tones. Hartwell Industries remains well positioned, the CFO said. However, we should anticipate some resistance from the board on discretionary spending. Evelyn nodded, eyes on the data. Her phone vibrated softly against the table. She ignored it. Then it vibrated again. A glance down revealed a single message. Daniel, hope you slept well. What, that was it. No emoji, no pressure. Just a thought, sent into the morning without expectation. Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest. She typed a response before she could overthink it. Evelyn, I did. Thank you for last night. The meeting continued. Numbers blurred together more than usual. Her attention drifted. Not enough to be noticed, but enough that she had to consciously pull herself back. By the time the meeting adjourned, the message thread remained open on her phone, quiet and unassuming. She didn't message again. Not yet. Daniel's day began differently. Mateo woke him before his alarm, climbing into bed with the unquestioning confidence of a child who believed the world would catch him. "Dad," Mateo whispered loudly. "I had a dream." Daniel smiled, eyes still closed. Was it a good one? Mateo considered this. It was a confusing one. The Daniel laughed softly and pulled him closer. "Those are the hardest kind." They moved through the morning together. Breakfast, backpack checks, shoes by the door. At school drop-off, Mateo hugged him tightly before running off toward his friends. Daniel stood there a moment longer than necessary. Then, he headed to work. The office building was already humming when he arrived. He changed into his uniform, clipped his ID badge into place, and grabbed his cart. Floors needed cleaning. Trash needed emptying. Offices needed to look untouched by the people who worked in them. As he mopped a hallway near the executive floor, he noticed something he hadn't before. A framed mission statement hung near the elevators. Integrity, accountability, transparency. The words felt heavier than usual. He wondered how many people passed them every day without seeing them. That evening, Evelyn didn't go straight home. She found herself driving without conscious direction, the city unfolding around her until she recognized the street. The cafe was closed now, lights dimmed, chairs stacked. She parked anyway. Sat there for a moment, rain misting the windshield. She didn't know why she had come, only that something in her resisted returning to the quiet sterility of her penthouse just yet. Her phone buzzed again. Daniel's long day. As she stared at the message, then smiled faintly. "Evelyn?" "Yes, yours, Daniel's always, but manageable." She imagined him saying it, steady, uncomplaining. Evelyn hesitated, then typed, "Evelyn, you like to have dinner again sometime?" The response came a minute later. "Daniel gar I would. I just need to plan ahead for Mateo." "Evelyn." "Of course." She started the car. As she pulled away, rain began to fall harder, streaking across the windshield. Neither of them knew it yet, but the small decision to meet again had already begun to bend the shape of what was coming. And somewhere, far above both their lives, forces were already moving, quietly, deliberately, toward a reckoning that would test everything they thought they could protect. The second dinner took longer to arrange than the first, not because either of them hesitated, but because life, in its quiet insistence, rarely moved aside just because something felt promising. For Daniel, it meant coordinating with his neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, who watched Mateo on nights when his shifts ran long. She listened with a knowing smile as he explained he needed an extra evening that week. "You should go," she said before he finished. "You forget you're allowed to." Daniel smiled, embarrassed. "It's just dinner." "That's how it starts," she replied, waving him off. For Evelyn, it meant canceling a networking reception she had been expected to attend. One of those events where people pretended to listen while waiting their turn to speak. She sent her regrets without explanation and felt a small, rebellious satisfaction as she shut her laptop. They chose a place neither of them had been before. A modest restaurant near the river, warm light spilling out through wide windows, rain glinting faintly on the pavement outside. It felt neutral, unclaimed by either of their routines. Daniel arrived first. He sat at the table near the window, hands folded loosely, watching the water move past in slow, dark currents. He had changed out of his work clothes, but not into anything new. Clean jeans, a button-down shirt carefully pressed. The same jacket, cuffs worn thin. When Evelyn walked in, the bell chimed softly again. He stood, this time without knocking his knee. "You made it," he said. "So did you," she replied, smiling. They settled into their seats more easily than before. The initial awkwardness was gone, replaced by something tentative but familiar, like a conversation paused, and then resumed rather than started anew. They ordered food, talked about small things again at first. The rain, the river, a story Daniel told about Mateo insisting the river was going somewhere important. "Isn't it?" Evelyn asked. Daniel considered. "I suppose it is. We just don't get to Sudware." The food arrived, simple, comforting. As they ate, Evelyn noticed how Daniel listened, not just to her words, but to the spaces between them. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush to fill silence. He allowed her thoughts to finish forming before responding. It was disarming. She found herself speaking more freely than she had intended, about growing up in a small apartment with a mother who worked too much and slept too little, about learning early that stability was something you built, not something you were given. Daniel didn't ask questions meant to probe. He asked questions meant to understand. "And now?" he asked gently. "Do you feel stable?" Evelyn paused, fork hovering above her plate. "I feel competent," she said carefully. "I'm very good at what I do." "That's not the same thing," he said, not unkindly. "No," she admitted. "It's not." She realized then that she had still not told him what she did. The truth hovered at the edge of the table between them, waiting. "Daniel," she said slowly, "there's something I should tell you." He looked at her calmly. "Okay. I run a company," she said, "a large one." He blinked once, then nodded. "All right." She waited for more. Surprise. Calculation. Curiosity sharpened into strategy. It didn't come. "That's impressive," he said instead. "You must carry a lot." The simplicity of the response caught her off guard. "Yes," she said quietly. "I do." He smiled faintly. "That explains the way you hold yourself. Like you're braced against something." She laughed softly, a sound edged with relief. They lingered over coffee after dinner. Neither rushed to leave. Outside, the rain eased, the river reflecting scattered lights from passing traffic. Eventually, Evelyn checked the time and frowned. "I should let you get home." Daniel nodded. "Mateo doesn't like it when I'm late." They stood together outside the restaurant, neither quite ready to say good night. "Thank you," Daniel said. "For telling me." "For listening," she replied. They parted with a quiet understanding that this, whatever it was no longer accidental. 2 days later, the ground shifted beneath Evelyn's feet. The board meeting was supposed to be routine, quarterly updates, strategic alignment, the usual choreography of agreement and polite dissent. Evelyn took her seat at the head of the table, tablet open, posture composed. Faces turned toward her, some familiar, some carefully neutral. She began her presentation. Halfway through, the interruption came. A board member cleared his throat. "Before we proceed," he said, "there are concerns we need to address." Evelyn stilled. "Concerns," she echoed. He slid a folder across the table. The paper inside was thick, official-looking. Financial summaries, vendor reports, charts highlighted in yellow. Evelyn scanned the first page. Something tightened in her chest. "These figures," she said slowly, "are incomplete." Another board member leaned forward. "They raise serious questions about discretionary spending under your authorization." The room shifted. Evelyn felt it. The subtle recalibration of attention, the way people leaned back just enough to create distance. "I would like to review the source documentation," she said evenly. "We intend to," the chairman replied. "But until then, the board feels it would be prudent to discuss temporary measures." The words were careful, polished, dangerous. "Temporary measures," Evelyn repeated. "Such as?" "Administrative oversight," he said. "Perhaps a short leave, to allow for transparency." Evelyn closed the folder slowly. She had built her career navigating rooms like this, reading tone, measuring intent. She knew when a question was a weapon long before it was swung. This wasn't concern. It was positioning. "I will not step aside based on unverified claims," she said calmly. "If there is an issue, we address it openly." The chairman smiled thinly. "That will be determined." The meeting ended shortly after. No resolution, no vote, just a promise of escalation. To that night, Evelyn sat alone in her office long after the building had emptied. The city glowed beyond the windows, indifferent and vast. She replayed the meeting in her mind, cataloging every expression, every pause. This wasn't random. Someone wanted her off balance. Her phone buzzed. "Daniel, how was your day?" She stared at the message longer than she needed to. Then she typed. "Evelyn's complicated. Daniel, do you want to talk about it?" And she hesitated. Then, "Evelyn, can I see you tonight?" The reply came almost immediately. "Daniel, yes, I'm at work. But you can come by." She didn't think. She grabbed her coat and left the office. 2. The building Daniel cleaned rose quietly out of the night. its glass facade reflecting rain-slicked streets. Evelyn entered through the lobby, her heels echoing softly against the marble floor. She rode the elevator up alone. When the doors opened on the 17th floor, she saw him immediately, pushing his cart down the hallway, movements steady, unhurried. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Evelyn?" he asked. "Is everything okay?" She tried to answer. The words caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. She crossed the hallway and sat down on a bench near the wall, shoulders sagging as the weight of the day finally pressed through her composure. Daniel set the cart aside at once. He didn't crowd her, didn't touch her. He just sat beside her, close enough to be present. "They're coming for me," she said finally. "My board, they're laying groundwork." He listened without interruption. When she finished, he spoke quietly. "Can I see what they showed you?" She looked at him surprised. "Yes," she said, handing him her tablet. Daniel took it carefully. As he began to read, his expression shifted, not into alarm, but focus. And in that quiet hallway, beneath fluorescent lights and the steady hum of the building, something subtle but irreversible began to change. Neither of them knew it yet. But the storm had found its first opening. Daniel read slowly, not because the material was difficult, but because habits formed under pressure never left you. He had learned long ago that numbers lied most convincingly when you rushed past them. He leaned back against the bench, tablet resting on his knee, one hand steadying it while the other scrolled with care. Evelyn watched him from the corner of her eye. She was used to people reacting quickly to information like this. Lawyers sharpening, executives deflecting, consultants already shaping narratives. Daniel did none of that. His face didn't register panic or judgment, only concentration. That, more than anything, unsettled her. After several minutes, he stopped scrolling. "These summaries," he said slowly, "they're grouped in a way that looks intentional." Evelyn straightened slightly. "Intentional how?" "Facilities, maintenance, and logistics are being bundled together," he replied. "They shouldn't be. Different cost centers, different approval paths." She frowned. "That grouping has never been standard." "It isn't," Daniel said, "but it makes the totals look inflated in one place instead of suspicious in several." Her pulse quickened. "You're saying it's designed to look sloppy?" "Yes," he said. "Not criminal. Just careless enough to justify intervention." Evelyn stared at the tablet, then at him. "How do you see that so quickly?" Daniel hesitated. For a moment, she thought he might deflect. Instead, he exhaled. "Before my wife got sick," he said quietly, "I was studying accounting. Forensic accounting I didn't finish." The hallway seemed to narrow around them. "You were studying forensic accounting," she repeated. He nodded. "Night classes. I was good at it. Patterns made sense to me." "And then?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "And then Sophia got sick," he said, "and some things stopped being optional." Evelyn swallowed. Her board had paid 7 figures to consultants who hadn't caught this. Daniel, a man mopping floors at night, had seen it in minutes. He continued scrolling. "Here," he said, pointing. "Authorization codes. These two are duplicated. Same signature pattern, different timestamps." Her breath caught. "That shouldn't be possible." "It shouldn't," he agreed. "Which means someone wanted it to be." Silence settled between them again, heavier now, charged. Evelyn leaned back against the wall, staring up at the ceiling. "They're setting me up," she said softly. "Yes," Daniel replied. "But not cleanly." She looked at him. "Can we prove it?" He considered that. "Not yet. But we can start asking the right questions." She laughed quietly once. "I can't believe this." Daniel smiled faintly. "Neither can I." For a moment, they simply sat there. Two people from opposite ends of the city's invisible hierarchy, bound together by a shared realization. This was bigger than either of them had expected. 2. Evelyn didn't go home that night. She stayed until Daniel's shift ended, sitting on benches and stairwells while he finished his rounds. The building felt different after midnight. Emptier, quieter, stripped of pretense. She watched him work, efficient and methodical, unseen by most of the world that depended on the shine he left behind. When his shift finally ended, he hesitated at the exit. "I should get home," he said. "Matteo will be up early." "Of course," she replied. "Thank you. For tonight." He nodded. "We should talk again. When you've had time to process." "Yes," she said. "We should." They parted without touching, without ceremony. But something had shifted. The next day, the board's pressure intensified. Evelyn was copied on emails she hadn't been before. Meetings were rescheduled without her input. A legal memo arrived mid-afternoon, carefully worded, outlining temporary governance safeguards. She read it twice, her expression unreadable. This was no longer a probe. It was an encirclement. She forwarded the memo to her legal counsel with a single line, "Do not respond yet." Then she texted Daniel. "Evelyn, F, can you look at something tonight?" The Daniel F, "Yes." Same place. Daniel's apartment was small but orderly, the kind of space shaped by routine rather than decoration. Toys were stacked neatly in one corner. A child's drawing was taped to the refrigerator. 3 stick figures holding hands under a lopsided sun. "This is us," Daniel said when he saw her looking, before Sophia got sick. Evelyn felt a tightening in her chest she didn't comment on. Matteo peeked around the corner when she entered, eyes curious but shy. "Hi," she said softly. He studied her, then nodded. "Hi." Daniel crouched beside him. "Matteo, this is Evelyn. Remember the lady I told you about?" Matteo's eyes widened slightly. "The coffee one." Daniel smiled. "Yes." Matteo considered her carefully, then returned to his drawing. Evelyn felt something warm and unfamiliar settle in her chest. They spread documents across the small kitchen table after Matteo went to bed. Daniel worked through them slowly, explaining as he went, not talking down, not showing off, just sharing what he saw. "They're counting on you responding emotionally," he said at one point, "defending your decisions instead of questioning theirs." Evelyn leaned back in her chair. "That's exactly what they've done to others." He nodded. "It works most of the time." She studied him. "You don't sound surprised." "I've seen it before," he said. "Different scale. Same tactics." The clock ticked quietly on the wall. At some point, Evelyn realized she hadn't checked her phone in over an hour. That never happened. When she left that night, the rain had returned, heavier now. Evelyn drove home with her hands steady on the wheel, mind racing. Her career was under attack. Her position was vulnerable. And the person helping her see the truth wasn't a lawyer or a consultant or a board ally. It was a widowed janitor with a child asleep in the next room. The irony didn't escape her, but neither did the clarity. For the first time since the board meeting, she didn't feel alone. And somewhere, far above the city streets, the storm continued to gather, quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment when pressure would finally force the truth into the open. By the end of the week, Evelyn could feel the shift everywhere. It was in the way conversation stopped just a second earlier when she entered a room. In the sudden politeness of emails that used to be direct, in the careful phrasing of questions that were never asked outright but hovered just beneath the surface. People were recalculating. She had spent most of her career being the one others adjusted around. Now the space she occupied felt conditional. Her legal counsel called late Friday afternoon. "They're building a narrative," he said. "Not a case yet, a story. One that makes intervention seem responsible." Evelyn stared out her office window at the city below. "How long do I have?" "That depends on how quickly they think you'll fold." "I won't," she said. "I know," he replied, "which is why they'll escalate." She ended the call and sat still for a long moment, hands folded neatly on the desk. The instinct to act, to call someone, to move first, rose sharply. Instead, she did something unfamiliar. She waited. That night, she went back to Daniel's building. Not because she needed information, because she needed steadiness. Daniel was finishing up on the 18th floor when he heard footsteps that didn't belong. He looked up from his cart and saw Evelyn approaching, coat draped over her arm, heels in her hand. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "You didn't text," he said gently. I didn't want to interrupt, she replied. Is that okay? He nodded immediately. Of course. They sat on the steps near the stairwell this time, a quiet pocket between floors. The building hummed around them. Ventilation, distant elevators, the soft rhythm of night work continuing unseen. They're isolating me, Evelyn said after a moment, slowly, carefully. Daniel leaned his elbows on his knees. That's usually phase 2. She glanced at him. Phase 2. He smiled faintly. Phase 1 is doubt. Phase 2 is loneliness. Phase 3 is panic. And phase 4, she asked. Collapse, he said. Unless you interrupt the sequence. She considered that. How? By refusing to behave the way they expect, he replied. They want you defensive. They want you loud or reckless. And if I don't give them that, they make mistakes. Evelyn studied his profile, the quiet certainty, the lack of theatrics. He spoke like someone who had learned these lessons the hard way. You sound like you've been here before, she said. Daniel was silent for a moment. Not like this, he said finally. But close enough. She didn't press. The following Monday, the board sent a formal notice. A special session, scheduled for the following week. Attendance required. Agenda pending. Evelyn read it twice. This was the opening move. She forwarded the notice to Daniel without comment. A minute later, her phone buzzed. Daniel, they're rushing. Evelyn, you think so? Daniel. Reth. If they were confident they'd slow it down, she smiled faintly at the screen. That evening, she came to Daniel's apartment earlier than usual. Matteo was at the table doing homework, tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. He looked up when she entered. Hi, he said. Hi, she replied. What are you working on? Math, he said solemnly. It's rude. She laughed softly and took a seat nearby, watching as Daniel cooked dinner with practiced ease. It struck her then how different this space felt from her own home. Smaller, yes, but lived in, evidence of a life that unfolded here rather than being scheduled. After dinner, while Matteo took a bath, Evelyn and Daniel spread papers across the table again. I went back through older filings, Daniel said, before the restructuring. There's a pattern. He showed her, quietly, methodically, how vendor relationships shifted just before certain board members gained influence, how approvals rerouted, how oversight weakened in specific areas. They didn't start with you, he said. They just waited until it was convenient. Evelyn leaned back, absorbing it. So this isn't about my decisions, she said. No, Daniel replied. It's about timing. She nodded slowly. They underestimated how much I'd notice. And how much help you'd accept, he added. She met his eyes. That might be the most dangerous part. The first real crack appeared midweek. An internal compliance officer requested a private meeting. Evelyn arrived prepared, composed. The officer closed the door carefully. I shouldn't be saying this, she began, but some of the data being circulated isn't original. It's been curated. Evelyn's pulse steadied rather than spiked. Can you document that? She asked. The woman hesitated. If I do, I need protection. You'll have it, Evelyn said without pause. That night, she told Daniel. They're nervous, he said. That means pressure is working. Or that they'll retaliate, Evelyn replied. He nodded. Both can be true. The retaliation came sooner than expected. Daniel noticed it first. His supervisor pulled him aside near the end of his shift, expression carefully neutral. Just a heads up, the man said. There may be some schedule changes coming up. Staffing review. Daniel understood immediately. They're watching me, he said later that night, voice steady but serious. Evelyn felt a flash of anger she didn't try to hide. I won't let them touch you. Daniel shook his head gently. That's not how this works. The moment you intervene, they know. She closed her eyes briefly. I never wanted you dragged into this. I walked in, he said quietly, eyes open. Silence settled between them. Then Daniel added, but there's a line. Matteo stays out of this. Of course, Evelyn said immediately. Always. They sat together, the weight of it pressing in. For the first time, Evelyn truly understood the cost of the fight. Not in money or reputation, but in proximity. Anyone close to her became leverage. The realization hardened something in her. So on Friday night, rain returned in earnest. Evelyn stood on Daniel's small balcony, city lights blurred through sheets of water. Daniel joined her, handing her a mug of tea. "They think pressure will make you retreat," he said. "They don't know me very well," she replied. He smiled. "No, but they're about to." She turned toward him, rain-speckled city stretching behind. "Daniel," she said, voice low, "if this gets worse, if they push harder, I need to know you'll tell me when to stop." He met her gaze. "And I need to know you won't try to carry it alone." They held that look for a moment longer than necessary. Something unspoken passed between them, not romance, not yet, but trust forged under strain. Inside, Matteo slept peacefully, unaware of the currents shifting around his small world. Outside, the storm gathered strength, and for the first time since this began, Evelyn felt something sharper than fear. She felt resolve. The memo did not announce itself. It sat on Evelyn Carter's desk like it belonged there, neither urgent nor dramatic, just another piece of paper waiting to be acknowledged. No red stamp, no letterhead, no hint of confrontation. That, more than anything, made it dangerous. She noticed it the moment she set her bag down, the faint shift in balance on the otherwise immaculate surface of her desk. Her assistant had already arranged the morning files in perfect alignment, as she always did. The envelope was the only thing that didn't belong to the day's choreography. Evelyn opened it slowly. Temporary suspension of discretionary authority. Pending internal review. That was all. No justification, no signature, no timeline. She read it again, not because she hadn't understood it, but because understanding was a habit that demanded confirmation. This was not removal. This was containment. They weren't pushing her out yet. They were shrinking the space around her, inch by inch, to see how she would respond when the walls pressed closer. Evelyn folded the memo neatly and placed it back on the desk. Her assistant hovered in the doorway, eyes sharp with concern. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Evelyn met her gaze. "Yes." The word landed cleanly, convincingly. Years of practice made it effortless. The assistant hesitated, then nodded and retreated. When the door closed, Evelyn leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. She had seen this tactic before. It was what happened when power didn't want to get its hands dirty. You removed access first. You isolated authority. You made sure the person under pressure began to feel irrelevant before they ever became expendable. She exhaled slowly. They were closer than she'd expected. To noon, the effects were visible. A meeting she usually chaired proceeded without her input. An approval request that would normally route through her office stalled somewhere unseen. Her calendar quietly emptied itself of anything consequential. People weren't defying her. They were avoiding her. That was worse. At 3:30, her legal counsel called. "They've begun restricting your functional authority," he said carefully. "Unofficially, of course." "I'm aware," Evelyn replied. "What's the timeline?" "That depends on how quickly they believe you'll react." "And if I don't?" There was a pause. "Then they escalate." And Evelyn thanked him and ended the call. She did not call anyone else. She did not send emails. She waited. Waiting, she knew unsettled people who believed control was a one-way street. That night, she went to Daniel's building earlier than usual. She didn't text ahead. She needed the steadiness of showing up without explanation. The lobby was quiet, its polished surfaces reflecting a city that never asked permission to keep moving. She rode the elevator alone, her reflection staring back at her with composed defiance. When the doors opened on the 17th floor, Daniel was halfway down the corridor, pushing his cart with measured precision. He looked up immediately. "They did something today," he said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn stopped beside him. "They restricted my authority." He nodded once. "I figured." "How?" she asked. "Because you're controlled," he replied. "And angry. And you came here instead of going home." She sat on the bench near the stairwell, posture straight, hands clasped together. "They're erasing me without touching me," she said. "It's efficient." Daniel leaned against the wall, arms folded loosely. That means they think you're still dangerous. She looked up at him. Dangerous enough to remove quietly. Yes, he agreed. They don't want to fight yet. And you? She asked. What do you think they want from me? Daniel considered that carefully. They want you to doubt your footing, he said. To start explaining yourself. To get tired. Evelyn's jaw tightened. I won't. I know, he said, which is why they'll shift tactics. She studied his face. You speak like someone who's seen this before. He hesitated. Not at this level, he said finally. But power behaves the same no matter the building. It isolates first, then it reframes. Reframes what? She asked. Reality, he replied. Until people forget who the problem was supposed to be. They changed how they worked after that. No more visible collaboration. No more spreading documents across open tables. Daniel began keeping notes offline, handwritten, methodical. Old instincts returned quickly, those learned in late, night study sessions years ago, when his life had still contained options. Evelyn brought information in pieces rather than stacks. Fragments that Daniel could absorb and place into context. Together, they weren't building a defense anymore. They were mapping behavior. This didn't start with you, Daniel said one night, tapping his notebook. You were the opportunity, not the origin. Evelyn watched him trace lines between names, dates, and decisions. So I was convenient. Yes, he replied, and competent, which made you threatening. She smiled faintly. I've always had that effect. The cost of proximity arrived quietly. Daniel's supervisor stopped him near the end of his shift on Wednesday night. Just a quick thing. The man said, voice casual. We're doing a routine staffing review. Daniel nodded. Okay. Some questions came up. The supervisor continued. About associations. Daniel understood instantly. Is there a problem? He asked calmly. The supervisor avoided his eyes. Not yet. That was enough. When Daniel told Evelyn later that night, her control slipped for just a second. They have no right, she said sharply. They don't need one, he replied. They just need leverage. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. I won't let them touch you or Matteo. Daniel met her gaze steadily. You can't protect us by reacting. She closed her eyes briefly. I know. And I need you to hear this, he continued. If they push toward my son, I step away. She opened her eyes immediately. Of course. No debate, he said. That's my line. She nodded once. It's mine too. The first public signal arrived Friday morning. A short article. Buried placement. Neutral tone. Questions raised about leadership stability at Hartwell Industries. No accusations. No sourcing. Just implication. Evelyn read it in silence, then closed her tablet. They're preparing the audience, Daniel said later, when she showed him. Yes, she replied. They want me to correct the record. Will you? She shook her head. Not yet. That night, rain returned in earnest, streaking down the windows of Daniel's apartment. Matteo slept peacefully in his room, unaware of the tension threading through the adults' voices. Evelyn stood on the small balcony, city lights blurred beyond the rain. Daniel joined her, handing her a mug of tea. They think pressure will make you retreat, he said. They don't know me very well, she replied. He smiled faintly. No, but they're learning. She turned to him, the weight of it settling fully now. Daniel, she said quietly, if this gets worse, if they escalate beyond strategy, I need you to tell me, and I need you to promise, he said, that you won't try to carry this alone just because you're used to it. She met his gaze, unwavering. I promise. They stood there together as rain fell steadily around them. Inside, a child slept safely. Outside, power shifted its weight, preparing its next move. And for the first time since the memo had appeared on her desk, Evelyn felt something steadier than fear. She felt prepared. The silence that followed the article was deliberate. Evelyn noticed it first in the absence of reaction. No frantic calls from the board. No public statements. No internal memos attempting to reassure or redirect. The company moved forward as if nothing had happened. as if the question mark hanging over her leadership were a minor inconvenience rather than a crack in the foundation. Silence, she knew, was a strategy. It allowed doubt to ferment on its own. She arrived at work early the next morning, earlier than usual, wanting to feel the building wake up around her. The lobby was quiet, the air still cool from overnight cleaning. Security nodded as she passed, respectful but reserved, as if unsure which version of her authority still applied. In the elevator, she studied her reflection. She looked the same, composed, controlled, unchanged, and yet everything had shifted. At her desk, the day unfolded in fragments. Meetings she attended but did not lead. Decisions rotted around her. Conversations that stopped when she entered a room and resumed only after she left. No one was openly defiant. That would have been easier. This was erosion. By mid-morning, she received a calendar invitation marked mandatory, special board session, attendance required, agenda to follow. She stared at the screen, pulse steady. They were done circling. They were ready to tighten. Evelyn forwarded the invitation to Daniel without comment. Several minutes passed before his reply came. Daniel, they're forcing the timeline. Evelyn, yes, means they think they're ahead, she exhaled slowly. Daniel felt the pressure in smaller, more immediate ways. The maintenance office felt different that week. Voices quieter, glances lingering longer than necessary. He was no stranger to being overlooked, but this was different. This was being seen and assessed. During a break, one of the supervisors stopped him near the supply room. "Everything good?" the man asked, tone casual. "Yes," Daniel replied. The supervisor hesitated. "You've had some visitors lately. Just making sure there's no conflict." "No conflict," Daniel said evenly. The man nodded, unconvinced, and walked away. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, hands steady on the cart handle. They were watching him now. That night, when Evelyn arrived, he didn't bother easing into the conversation. "They're testing how far they can go," he said. She nodded. "They've called a special board session." His jaw tightened slightly. "Soon, Wes." "Then they're done pretending this is procedural," he said. "This will be personal." They met that evening in Daniel's apartment rather than the building. Mateo was awake, sitting on the floor with his toys, building something complicated and precarious. He looked up when Evelyn entered and smiled, the uncomplicated warmth of a child who hadn't learned to question consistency yet. "Hi," he said. "Hey," she replied, kneeling briefly to his level. "What are you building?" "A city," he said proudly. "It has rules." Daniel laughed softly. Everything has rules, apparently. After Mateo went to bed, the apartment felt smaller, quieter, the walls close enough to hold secrets. They spread documents across the table again. Copies, notes, timelines Daniel had reconstructed from memory and research. This time, the mood was different, less reactive, more deliberate. "They'll accuse you of mismanagement," Daniel said, tracing a line between two names, but not directly. "They'll frame it as concern for stability." "They always do," Evelyn replied. "They'll ask for a leave," he continued. "Temporary, voluntary, framed as cooperation." Evelyn smiled without humor. "I won't give them that. They'll expect resistance," Daniel said. "What they won't expect is precision." She leaned forward. "Then we give them precision." They planned quietly, not in sweeping gestures, but in careful sequencing. Who spoke when? Which documents were introduced first? What questions were asked and, more importantly, which ones were left unanswered until the room demanded them? "This only works if you stay calm," Daniel said. "They'll try to provoke you." "I'm very good at calm," Evelyn replied. He studied her. "This is different. They're going to question your judgment, your motives, your credibility." She met his gaze. "I know. And if they bring me up?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. "That's the wild card," she said finally. "They may imply external influence." Daniel nodded. "Then we don't deny it. We contextualize it." "You're not external," she said quietly. "Your insight," he smiled faintly. "That's not how they'll see it." "No," she agreed. "But it's how the truth will. Light, The night before the board session, Evelyn didn't sleep. She lay in bed, city lights casting shifting patterns across the ceiling, her mind cycling through contingencies. She had faced hostile negotiations before, had walked into rooms where everyone wanted something from her and left with terms she controlled. This felt different. This wasn't about winning. It was about not being erased. She rose before dawn and dressed carefully, choosing a suit that projected steadiness rather than dominance. She pinned her hair back, simple and precise. No armor, no flourish. At Daniel's apartment, he prepared Mateo for school, moving through the morning routine with practiced ease. Evelyn watched from the doorway, a quiet ache forming in her chest. "You don't have to come today?" Daniel said when he noticed her expression. "I want to," she replied. Mateo hugged her before leaving quick and unthinking. "Good," Daniel told him. Mateo grinned. "I always am." After they were alone again, Daniel handed Evelyn a folder. "Everything we mapped," he said. Condensed. She took it, feeling the weight. "Thank you." He hesitated. "If this goes sideways." She shook her head. "It won't. And if it does." He pressed. "I want you to remember something." She looked at him. "You didn't imagine this," he said. "You're not wrong. And you're not alone." The words settled deeper than any strategy. The boardroom was full when Evelyn arrived. Faces turned toward her, some guarded, some curious, some already resigned to whatever outcome the day would bring. Legal counsel sat along one wall. A representative from compliance lingered near the back, eyes sharp. The chairman called the meeting to order. "We're here," he began, "to discuss recent concerns regarding leadership stability and governance." Evelyn listened, hands folded calmly on the table. They spoke for a long time before inviting her to respond. She waited until the room had exhausted itself. Then she stood. She did not defend herself. She asked questions, clear ones, precise ones. "Can you clarify the source of these figures? Who authorized this reclassification? At what point was oversight removed, and by whom?" The room shifted. The questions were not emotional. They were structural. When someone attempted to redirect the conversation toward her judgment, she didn't argue. She presented timelines, patterns. Silence grew heavier with each answer. Finally, the chairman leaned back, expression tight. "This is becoming adversarial," he said. "No," Evelyn replied calmly. "It's becoming accurate." The session adjourned without resolution. But something fundamental had changed. As Evelyn left the building, reporters gathered outside, cameras raised. She did not stop. She walked straight past them, posture steady, expression unreadable. Across the city, Daniel watched a muted feed on his phone from the break room, heart steady but alert. The storm had broken. Now came the aftermath. And none of them, board members, executives, or observers, could pretend anymore that Evelyn Carter was standing alone. The fallout did not explode. It seeped. Evelyn felt it the moment she stepped back into the building the morning after the board session. Not as confrontation, but as a subtle reordering of space. People moved differently around her now. Not away, not toward. Around, like water adjusting to a new obstruction in its path. She had not won, but she had not lost. And in rooms shaped by power, that unsettled everyone. Her office looked the same, but it no longer felt like command central. Documents sat waiting for approval that no longer routed automatically through her desk. A meeting she had expected to lead had already concluded by the time she checked her calendar. No one apologized. No one explained. They were continuing the erasure. Evelyn closed her door and sat down slowly, hands resting flat on the desk. This was the phase most people broke, not when attacked, but when ignored. She opened the folder Daniel had given her and reread the condensed notes, not because she needed the information, but because she needed the grounding. Facts, patterns, reality. A reminder that what she was experiencing was not imagined. Her phone buzzed. "Daniel, how does it feel this morning?" She considered the question carefully before answering. "Evening-like, standing in a room where the furniture has been moved overnight." The reply came a moment later. "Daniel, then you're still in the room," as she smiled faintly. 2. Across the city, Daniel felt the shift more acutely. Visibility had a cost when you lived close to the ground. The maintenance office was quieter than usual when he arrived for his shift. Conversations lowered as he passed. One of the newer supervisors glanced at him twice before looking away, as if unsure whether acknowledging him would register somewhere it shouldn't. Daniel didn't react. He moved through the building with the same steady efficiency he always had. Floors cleaned. Trash emptied. Glass polished until it reflected a version of the city no one questioned. But he noticed everything. 2 security guards stationed near the executive elevator instead of 1. A compliance officer lingering longer than necessary near the records room. His access badge scanned twice before unlocking a door it had always opened on the first try. They weren't targeting him directly. They were measuring him. That night, Evelyn came to his apartment later than usual. Mateo was asleep, curled tightly around his blanket, his breathing deep and even. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of rain against the windows. Evelyn stood just inside the door for a moment, as if recalibrating. They didn't respond, she said finally. No memo. No clarification. Nothing. Daniel nodded. Silence means they're deciding which lever to pull next. She exhaled. I hate that you're right. They sat at the kitchen table, not spreading documents this time. Just sitting. Letting the quiet hold them. I need to ask you something, Evelyn said after a moment. Daniel looked up. Okay. If this turns personal, if they try to make you the story, I need to know you'll step back. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair, gaze fixed on the ceiling, as if searching for the words rather than the courage. I'll step back if Mateo is at risk, he said finally. Not before. Her chest tightened. That's not fair. No, he agreed. But it's honest. She nodded, accepting it because she had no right not to. The first attempt came 3 days later. It arrived as a question dressed as concern. An internal ethics inquiry requested clarification on external advisory influence in recent executive decision-making. The phrasing was careful, non-accusatory, vague enough to plant suspicion without making claims. Evelyn read it once, then forwarded it to her legal counsel. She did not forward it to Daniel. Not yet. Instead, she requested a meeting with compliance, formal, documented, transparent. When the meeting took place, she arrived alone. You're asking the wrong question, she said calmly, before anyone else could speak. The issue isn't whether I received input. The issue is why this input was necessary in the first place. The compliance officer shifted. We're simply ensuring that the process appears clean. Evelyn finished. I understand, but appearance is not the same as integrity. The room went quiet. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Daniel learned about the inquiry from someone else. A junior staff member pulled him aside near the end of his shift, voice low. Just so you know, your name came up. Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Where? He asked calmly. In a question, the man replied. Not a statement. That was worse. Daniel went home that night restless. He sat at the kitchen table long after the apartment went quiet, staring at the notebook he had been using to map timelines and patterns. He thought about Sophia, about how she used to tell him that some fights were worth losing sleep over. He thought about Mateo. He thought about Evelyn, standing alone in rooms designed to wear people down. By morning, he had made a decision. Evelyn received the message while in transit. Daniel, we need to talk today. Not tonight. Today. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Evelyn, what happened? Daniel? Nothing yet. That's the problem. They met at the cafe where they'd first sat together weeks earlier. The same chipped mugs. The same window streaked with rain. Daniel arrived first. When Evelyn sat down across from him, he didn't waste time. They're positioning me, he said. Not to accuse, to imply. She felt a sharp spike of anger. I told you I wouldn't let them. I know, he interrupted gently. And I'm not asking you to fix it. She stared at him. Then what are you asking? I'm asking you to let me be visible, he said, on my terms. Her breath caught. Daniel, if they're going to use proximity as a weapon, He continued, then secrecy only sharpens it. Transparency dulls it. She shook her head slowly. They'll tear you apart. They'll try, he said, but they don't know me, and they don't control my story. Silence stretched between them. Evelyn leaned back, studying him, not as a CEO assessing risk, but as a woman watching someone she cared about choose exposure for the sake of principle. You're sure? She asked quietly. Yes. She nodded once. Then we do it carefully. The next move was subtle. Daniel did not appear in boardrooms or press releases. He appeared on record, a formal declaration submitted through legal channels outlining his role: unpaid, informal, observational, no decision-making authority, no influence beyond pattern recognition and data interpretation. It was unremarkable. That was the point. By the time the board realized what had happened, the narrative had shifted. They could no longer suggest hidden influence without contradicting documented transparency. The accusation lost its teeth. The backlash was immediate, but muted. 2 board members requested a closed-door session with Evelyn. She declined. Anything relevant can be documented, she said calmly. The request did not come again. That evening, Evelyn and Daniel stood on the balcony of his apartment, rain falling softly around them. You didn't have to do that, she said. Yes, he replied. I did. She turned to him. You changed the terrain. He smiled faintly. You taught me how. Inside, Mateo slept peacefully. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer a battle about power, it was about truth. And truth, once placed on record, had a way of surviving storms, even the ones still gathering overhead. The decision to place Daniel's role on record did not end the tension, it redirected it. Evelyn felt the shift almost immediately, not as relief, but as recalibration. The board did not challenge the disclosure directly. That would have required acknowledging it. Instead, they adjusted their posture, their language, their timelines. They began to move sideways. 2 days after the declaration was filed, Evelyn arrived at work to find a new calendar invitation waiting for her. No subject line, no agenda, just a time and a room number. She knew better than to ignore it. The room was smaller than the main boardroom, tucked away on a quieter floor. When she entered, only 3 people were present: the chairman, 1 senior board member she had never fully trusted, and outside counsel. No assistants, no observers. This was meant to feel intimate. Thank you for coming, the chairman said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Evelyn sat without comment. We want to clear the air, he continued. Recent events have created distractions. Distractions from what? Evelyn asked calmly. The board member beside him shifted. From stability. From continuity. Evelyn folded her hands on the table. Stability doesn't come from silence. It comes from accuracy. The chairman smiled thinly. You're reframing this as a moral issue. It's a governance issue. It's both, Evelyn replied. You don't get to separate them when it's convenient. The outside counsel cleared his throat. Ms. Carter, no one is accusing you of misconduct. But perception matters. External associations have been documented transparently. Evelyn interrupted, which removes ambiguity. If you're concerned about perception, that should reassure you. Silence followed. This was the moment they tested pressure again. We're proposing a temporary compromise, the chairman said. A short leave, voluntary. It would allow the company to recalibrate without ongoing speculation. Evelyn did not respond immediately. She studied their faces, measured, rehearsed, certain she would blink. I will not step aside, she said evenly, voluntary or otherwise. The senior board member leaned forward. You're leaving us very little room. Evelyn met his gaze. You created the room. I'm just refusing to shrink inside it. The meeting ended without resolution. Again, but this time, Evelyn felt something different as she left. Not adrenaline, not anger, momentum. Daniel felt the consequences of visibility that same afternoon. His supervisor called him into the office again, this time with HR present. The tone was polite, procedural, exhausting. We just need to update some records, the HR representative said. Given recent disclosures. Daniel nodded. What records? External activities. Time allocations. Communications. Daniel answered calmly. Truthfully, he had nothing to hide, but he noticed the way questions circled back on themselves. The way answers were noted more carefully than necessary. The way the meeting stretched longer than it needed to. They were fishing. When he returned to his shift, his hands moved automatically, muscle memory carrying him through tasks his mind barely registered. He wasn't afraid, but he was tired. That evening, when Evelyn arrived at his apartment, she saw it immediately. "They're leaning on you," she said. "Yes," he replied, softly. "For now." Her jaw tightened. "I'm sorry." Daniel shook his head. "This is what standing next to someone looks like." "I knew that." She nodded, but the guilt sat heavy in her chest. Mateo interrupted before the conversation could sink deeper, padding into the room with his blanket trailing behind him. "Can we watch something?" he asked sleepily. They did. The three of them sat together on the couch, a children's movie playing softly in the background. Mateo fell asleep halfway through, his head tipping against Daniel's shoulder, his small hand still clutching the edge of Evelyn's sleeve. Evelyn didn't move. She watched Daniel instead, his posture careful, protective, his expression unreadable as he stared at the screen. Later, after Mateo was tucked back into bed, Evelyn spoke. "I don't want him to remember this as a time when his father was always tense," she said quietly. Daniel leaned back against the counter. "He won't. Kids remember consistency more than conflict." "And what about you?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "I remember worse." The next escalation came from an unexpected direction. A regulator requested preliminary interviews. Not subpoenas, not charges, questions. Evelyn welcomed it. She arrived prepared, documents neatly organized, posture open. She answered every question with clarity, offering context rather than defense. When the regulator asked about Daniel, Evelyn didn't hesitate. "He provided pattern analysis," she said. "No authority, no decision-making power. The same way any consultant would, without compensation." The regulator nodded, making notes. "And you disclosed this once it became relevant." "Wes." "Earlier than required," the man observed. Evelyn met his gaze. Because waiting would have implied intent. The interview ended without incident. But word traveled fast. By the following morning, the board's tone shifted again. Emails grew shorter. Meetings were postponed rather than scheduled. The sense of control they had once projected began to fray. Daniel noticed it too. One of the supervisors who had been avoiding him stopped him near the elevators. "Looks like things are settling," the man said awkwardly. Daniel nodded politely. "That's good," but he didn't believe it. Not yet. The real straining arrived that weekend. Daniel was studying at the kitchen table, books spread out, notes scribbled in the margins. Mateo sat nearby, drawing quietly. Evelyn watched them from the doorway, a strange ache filling her chest. This ordinary moment felt fragile. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She answered without thinking. "Ems Carter." A voice said smoothly. "This is Thomas Hale." Her pulse stilled. She recognized the name immediately. Senior counsel. One of the board's sharpest instruments. "Yes," she replied. "I thought it might be productive to speak directly," he said. "Off the record." Evelyn glanced toward the kitchen table, toward Daniel. "I don't do off the record," she said calmly. "Pity," Hale replied. "It limits flexibility." "Say what you're calling to say," she said. A pause. "Your associate," Hale continued, "is becoming a liability." Evelyn's grip tightened on the phone. "He is not my associate." "Call him what you like," Hale said. "But his presence complicates matters. For you, for him." Evelyn's voice hardened. "If this is a threat, it's an observation." Hale interrupted smoothly. "People with children should be especially careful." The line went dead. Evelyn stood frozen for a moment, the air suddenly too thin. Daniel looked up. "Who was that?" She walked toward him slowly. "They crossed a line," she said. That night, sleep did not come easily. Evelyn lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Hale's words replaying with sickening precision. Daniel sat beside her, equally still, sensing the shift even without full details. "They mentioned Mateo," she said finally. Daniel turned toward her, alert instantly. How? Indirectly, she replied. But clearly, Daniel exhaled slowly, anger flickering beneath his calm. Then we adjust. No, Evelyn said sharply. Then we end this. He shook his head. You don't back down when bullies lean in. And you don't gamble with your child, she shot back. Silence fell between them, heavy and unresolved. Finally, Daniel spoke. I won't step away because they threaten me, he said. That teaches Matteo the wrong lesson. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. And what lesson does it teach if they hurt you anyway? Daniel met her gaze steadily. That truth is worth standing for, even when it costs. She stared at him, torn between admiration and fear. This was no longer strategy. This was conviction. The next morning, Evelyn made a decision. She forwarded a detailed account of Hale's call to her legal counsel and to the regulator. No embellishment, no accusation, just record. Then she sent a message to Daniel. Evelyn. They showed their hand. Daniel, then we stopped playing defense. They met later that day at the cafe again, rain streaking the windows like the first night they'd sat there. Daniel leaned forward, voice low but steady. If they're willing to imply harm, they're desperate. Yes, Evelyn replied. Which means exposure is the only shield left. She reached across the table, resting her hand over his. I won't let them isolate you, she said, not quietly. Daniel squeezed her fingers once. Then we do this together. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming harder against the glass. Inside, a line had been crossed, by the board, by power, by fear. And for the first time since the storm began, Evelyn was no longer reacting. She was preparing to end it. The decision to document the call changed the temperature of everything. Evelyn felt it immediately, not in dramatic reversals, but in the way people began to choose their words more carefully around her. Emails arrived with more recipients copied than necessary. Meetings included legal observers who sat quietly in the corners, pens poised, faces unreadable. The machine had sensed resistance. It was recalibrating. Evelyn arrived early the next morning, long before most of the building stirred. She wanted the quiet, not to think, but to feel the space again, to remind herself that this company, this structure of glass and steel and influence, had once been something she built rather than something that pressed against her. She stood by the windows of her office, watching the city wake. Cars streamed along the streets below, headlights cutting through lingering mist. People hurried with purpose she recognized. People who believed effort guaranteed safety. She knew better now. Her phone vibrated. Legal counsel, we received your note. You did the right thing. This matters. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Doing the right thing rarely felt like relief. It felt like stepping onto thinner ice. By mid-morning, confirmation arrived from the regulator. Acknowledgement only, no promises. But acknowledgement meant the record existed now, immutable and inconvenient. That was leverage. She did not tell Daniel immediately. She needed time to decide how much truth to share and how much fear to absorb alone. But Daniel sensed it anyway. Daniel noticed the shift not in emails or memos. He noticed it in the way the building watched him. Not openly, not aggressively, but differently. Security lingered longer when he passed. A compliance officer nodded once too often. His access badge scanned slower, as if waiting for permission that never quite arrived. He moved carefully through his shift, the rhythm of work grounding him. Floors cleaned. Trash emptied, reflections restored. The building looked pristine. It always did. That irony was not lost on him. During his break, he sat alone in the small staff room, notebook open in front of him. He didn't write. He simply traced patterns already formed in his mind. Escalation followed resistance. Silence followed exposure. Pressure followed patience. They were nearing a pivot point. When his phone buzzed, he knew who it would be before he checked. Evelyn, can you come by tonight? Earlier than usual. Daniel, yes. No questions. 2. That evening, the apartment felt quieter than it should have. Matteo was at a friend's house for a sleepover, his backpack already packed by the door for morning pickup. The absence of his presence made the space feel larger and more vulnerable all at once. Evelyn arrived carrying a tension she didn't try to hide. They acknowledged it, she said the moment the door closed behind her. Daniel leaned against the counter. The regulator. She nodded. Yes. That's good, he said. It's necessary, she corrected. Not good. He studied her face. What aren't you saying? And Evelyn hesitated, then exhaled slowly. They'll come for credibility next, she said. If they can't move me procedurally, they'll try to move the ground beneath me. Daniel nodded. Character. Wes. And proximity, he added. She met his gaze. Which means you. Silence settled between them. Daniel broke it first. Then we stop pretending this is just about work, he said. We acknowledge what they already see. Evelyn frowned. You mean us? Wes. Her pulse quickened. Not with fear, but with recognition. They'll frame it as compromise, she said. Conflict of interest. They'll frame it however they want, Daniel replied. But hiding doesn't protect you anymore. She turned away briefly, pacing the small kitchen. I built my life on containment, she said quietly. On separating personal from professional so no one could ever leverage one against the other. Daniel watched her carefully. And did it work? She stopped. No, she admitted. He nodded. Then maybe the risk isn't connection. Maybe it's pretending you don't have one. Evelyn sank into the chair at the table, the weight of the truth settling heavily. What if acknowledging us gives them exactly what they want? She asked. Daniel stepped closer, resting his hands on the table in front of her. What they want is control. Visibility doesn't give them that. It takes it away. She looked up at him. You're asking me to change how I fight, she said. I'm asking you to stop fighting alone, he replied. The next day the counterattack arrived, cleaner this time. A confidential briefing circulated among senior leadership outlining concerns about executive judgment influenced by external emotional factors. The language was clinical, bloodless, but the intent was clear. Evelyn read it without expression, then forwarded it to legal and compliance with a single line. This framing is inappropriate and unsupported. This she requested a formal response be logged. By noon, the rumor mill had begun. Daniel heard about it through fragments, half-finished sentences, looks that lingered too long. Someone mentioned Evelyn's name followed by the word personal, and then fell silent. He finished his shift early that night. When he arrived home, Evelyn was already there, sitting on the couch, coat still on, hands clasped tightly together. They're trying to reduce me to motive, she said flatly. Daniel sat beside her. And you. I'm done letting them. She turned toward him, eyes steady. I want to make a statement, she said. He did not interrupt. Not to the press. She continued. Internally, on record, clear, honest. Daniel felt a flicker of concern. About what? About who you are, she said. And who I am. And why integrity doesn't disappear just because someone offers insight without a title. He searched her face. Are you sure? No, she said honestly. But I'm certain hiding is worse. They sat together for a long moment, the decision solidifying not through urgency, but resolve. The statement was brief. It acknowledged Daniel's analytical contribution, defined its boundaries, reiterated her responsibility and accountability, rejected the notion that insight became corruption simply because it came from outside expected hierarchies. It did not apologize, did not explain their personal connection. It didn't need to. By the time it circulated, the response was immediate and divided. Some were unsettled, some relieved, some quietly impressed. The board was furious. That night, Evelyn received another call from Thomas Hale. She didn't answer. Instead, she forwarded the missed call notification to legal. Then she turned her phone off. Later, Daniel stood by the window, rain streaking softly down the glass, city lights shimmering beyond. You know this gets harder now, he said. Yes, Evelyn replied. But it gets cleaner. He turned toward her. I don't regret this. She stepped closer. Neither do I. For the first time since the storm began, there was no sense of scrambling. Only direction. They stood together in the quiet, two lives intersecting not by accident but by choice, knowing that whatever came next would demand more than strategy. It would demand courage, and both of them were ready. The internal statement did not detonate the way the board expected. There was no immediate backlash, no emergency injunction, no rushed counter memo attempting to clarify intent. Instead, the response unfolded slowly, unevenly, like a fault line revealing itself one fracture at a time. Evelyn felt it in the shift of energy rather than action. People began to ask questions again. Not loudly, not publicly, but in hallways, in closed offices, in messages sent late at night that started with phrases like "fess off the record." And as if I shouldn't be saying this, but the statement had done what it was meant to do. It had broken the illusion that power moved in one direction. By midweek, compliance requested follow-up documentation, not accusatory, not hostile, curious, precise. The kind of questions that signaled real oversight rather than performative review. Evelyn welcomed it. She provided everything. Transparency, she knew, only scared people who were hiding. The board, however, did not welcome it. A closed-door session was convened without her present. Evelyn learned about it not through formal notice, but through a misrouted calendar alert that landed in her inbox by mistake. She stared at the screen for a long moment. They were regrouping, not strategizing, retrenching. That distinction mattered. She forwarded the alert to legal and made no comment. Daniel saw the tension the moment she arrived that night. "They're meeting without you," he said. "Yes, that's not governance," he continued. "That's fear." She nodded, setting her bag down. "They're deciding whether to escalate or retreat." "And?" he asked. "And they don't agree," she replied. Daniel studied her face carefully. "You're calm. I'm focused," she corrected. "There's a difference." Daniel's world shifted in quieter ways. The HR requests stopped coming. The polite inquiries vanished. No more casual questions about his time allocation or external communications. At first, the absence unsettled him more than the scrutiny had. Then he recognized it. They had realized he was no longer an easy pressure point. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't panicking. And he wasn't isolated. That made him unpredictable. During his shift, a junior analyst stopped him near the elevators. "Can I ask you something?" she said hesitantly. "Yes," Daniel replied. "Is it true you helped her see things others missed?" Daniel considered the question. "I helped organize information," he said. "She did the rest." The woman nodded slowly. "I thought so." She walked away without another word. Daniel stood there for a moment, struck by the realization that the story had already begun to change. Quietly, organically, beyond anyone's control. The real pivot arrived Thursday morning. A formal notice from the regulator landed in Evelyn's inbox. Not an investigation. A review. Scope defined. Timeline established. Board conduct included explicitly. Evelyn read it twice. This was no longer a matter of internal politics. It had crossed into accountability. She closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, a slow breath leaving her lungs. This was the moment power hated most. The moment it could no longer manage consequences privately. Her phone buzzed. "Danielle, you're very quiet today. Because something finally moved. Danielle, good or bad?" She paused before answering. "Evelyn, if necessary, that evening." The building felt different again. Not cautious, watchful. Evelyn passed through the lobby with her usual composure, but eyes followed her now with something new behind them. Not fear, not suspicion. Recognition. In the elevator, two executives stood beside her in silence. When the doors opened, one of them spoke softly. "You did the right thing," he said. Evelyn nodded once. "Thank you." That was all. Daniel felt the shift at home. Mateo came back from his sleepover, buzzing with stories, energy filling the apartment in a way that made the walls feel warmer. "Did you know?" Mateo said seriously at dinner, "that grown-ups lie more than kids." Daniel blinked. "Who told you that?" "Lucas's mom," Mateo replied. "She said kids don't know how yet." Daniel laughed softly. "Some never learn how to stop." Mateo looked thoughtful. "You don't lie." Daniel met his son's gaze. "I try not to." Evelyn watched the exchange quietly, something tender tightening in her chest. Later that night, after Mateo was asleep, she spoke what she'd been holding back. "If this ends badly," she said. "I don't want your life to shrink because of me." Daniel leaned against the counter, arms folded. "My life already grew." She looked at him. "You don't know that." He smiled faintly. "I do." The board made its move the following morning. A formal request for mediation, voluntary, neutral, framed as cooperation. Evelyn read it once, then set it aside. "They're trying to regain narrative control," Daniel said when she told him. "Yes," she replied. "They want to appear reasonable now that oversight is real." "Will you agree?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because mediation assumes parity," she said. "And they haven't earned it." Daniel considered that. "They're running out of moves." "So am I," she replied. The tension reached a breaking point not with shouting or spectacle, but with exhaustion. One night, Evelyn sat at the edge of Daniel's couch, shoulders slumped, heels kicked off, head in her hands. "I'm tired," she admitted quietly. Not of fighting, of bracing. Daniel sat beside her, close but not touching. "You don't have to be invincible all the time," he said. "I know," she replied. "But I don't know how to stop being ready." He thought for a moment, then spoke carefully. "Maybe readiness doesn't mean armor," he said. "Maybe it means trust." She looked up at him, eyes rimmed with fatigue and something softer. "Trust who?" she asked. Daniel met her gaze steadily. "The people who stayed." She exhaled, a sound that felt like release. The review process officially began the next week. Documents were requested, interviews scheduled, timelines drawn. The board's confidence cracked visibly, and through it all, Evelyn stood, not defiant, not withdrawn, but grounded, not because she was certain of the outcome, but because, for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't standing alone in the storm. She had chosen transparency over control, connection over isolation, and whatever came next, win or loss, triumph or transition, would be faced not from a place of fear, but from a life that had already begun to change. Quietly, irreversibly. The review process altered the rhythm of Evelyn's days in ways no calendar could capture. Time slowed, then stretched. Meetings no longer flowed naturally from one decision to the next. Instead, they paused, held in suspension by documentation requests, interview schedules, and the careful choreography of oversight. Nothing moved quickly now, and that, Evelyn understood, was intentional. Delay was a form of pressure. She adapted by refusing to rush. Each morning, she arrived early, not to get ahead, but to reclaim the building in its quiet hours. She walked the corridors before they filled, noticing things she had ignored for years. The faint scuff marks near the elevators, the way light fell differently on each floor, the subtle signs of people who worked unseen to keep the place functional. She thought of Daniel, of how much of the world depended on people who were rarely acknowledged unless something went wrong. The irony was not lost on her. By midweek, the first interviews began. Evelyn sat across from regulators in rooms stripped of personality, answering questions she had anticipated and some she hadn't. She spoke plainly, offered context, corrected assumptions without defensiveness. When asked why she hadn't acted sooner on the irregularities, she didn't justify. "I trusted the system," she said simply. That trust was misplaced. The honesty landed heavier than any excuse could have. After one interview, a junior regulator lingered as others filed out. "For what it's worth," the woman said quietly, "most people in your position would have protected themselves first." Evelyn met her gaze. "I did." The woman looked surprised. "By telling the truth," Evelyn added. Too, Daniel felt the review process ripple outward in subtler ways. The building where he worked became busier with people who didn't belong. Consultants with clipped speech and expensive shoes. Auditors who asked questions but rarely listened to answers. They moved through the space as if it were a problem to be solved rather than a place people inhabited. Daniel watched them carefully. He noticed who avoided eye contact, who lingered near offices long after questions were answered, who took notes that didn't correspond to what had been said. Patterns, he reminded himself, always revealed intent. One evening, as he finished mopping near the executive floor, an auditor stopped him. "You're Daniel Reyes," the man said. Yes, Daniel replied evenly. You've been mentioned in a few interviews. The auditor continued. As someone who noticed inconsistencies. Daniel waited. That's unusual. The man added. Given your role. Daniel met his gaze calmly. Truth doesn't depend on role. The auditor studied him for a moment, then nodded once. No, it doesn't. When the man walked away, Daniel felt a strange mix of fatigue and resolve settle into his bones. This was no longer invisible work. The cost of visibility returned that weekend. Mateo came home from school quieter than usual, his backpack heavier on his shoulders than it should have been. Daniel noticed immediately. What's wrong? He asked gently. Mateo hesitated. Someone said you were on TV. Daniel's chest tightened. What did they say? Mateo shrugged. That you worked with a boss who was in trouble. Daniel crouched to Mateo's level. Did that scare you? Mateo thought about it. A little. Daniel nodded. Thank you for telling me. That night, Daniel told Evelyn. She felt the familiar surge of anger rise, and then something colder beneath it. They crossed another line, she said. Daniel shook his head. Not yet. This is the echo. The rest is noise. She looked at him. He shouldn't have to hear any of this. I won't remember the details, Daniel said quietly. I'll remember how we handled it. The weight of that settled deeply in her chest. The board attempted one final maneuver. A letter arrived late Friday afternoon. Carefully worded, legal framed as reconciliation. It proposed a restructuring that would keep Evelyn in name, but redistribute authority for the duration of the review. A graceful demotion. Evelyn read it once. Then she laughed. A short, humorless sound. They still think this is about position, she said to Daniel that night. They don't know how to see anything else, he replied. Her legal counsel advised caution. Negotiation. Optics. Evelyn listened. Then she declined, in writing, on record, without insult or explanation. She did not counter. She did not ask for time. She simply refused. The silence that followed was different from before. Not strategic. Hollow. As the weeks passed, something unexpected happened. The company began to steady itself, not because the review was over. It wasn't. But because people stopped waiting for permission to do the right thing. Middle managers spoke up. Teams corrected processes without being asked. Decisions were documented more carefully. Evelyn noticed it in small ways. An email CC'd to compliance without prompting. A report revised before it reached her desk. A quiet acknowledgement from someone who had once kept their distance. Culture, she realized, didn't change with speeches. It changed with example. One evening, as rain returned in soft sheets against the windows, Evelyn sat beside Daniel on the couch, Mateo asleep in the next room. I used to believe power insulated you, she said quietly. That it made you untouchable. Daniel leaned back, considering. It doesn't. It just delays the moment you have to decide who you are. She smiled faintly. I waited too long. You waited until it mattered, he replied. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Evelyn spoke again, her voice steadier than it had been in weeks. If this ends with me losing my position, she said, I don't regret any of it. Daniel turned to her. That's how I know you won. She met his gaze, something warm and certain passing between them. Outside, the rain continued its quiet work, washing, softening, revealing. And inside, two lives moved closer to a truth neither of them had planned, but both had chosen. Whatever the outcome of the review, something irreversible had already taken place. Evelyn Carter was no longer defined by the role she held, and Daniel Reyes was no longer invisible. Together, they were becoming something stronger than either had been alone. The waiting became its own kind of trial. Not the anxious, pacing kind. Evelyn had long since learned how to master that, but the slower, heavier kind that crept in during still moments and refused to leave. The review process moved forward with mechanical precision, but the spaces between official updates stretched uncomfortably wide. Nothing happened quickly anymore. That, she knew, was intentional. Regulators asked for additional documentation that already existed. Interviews were rescheduled without explanation. Decisions that should have taken days took weeks. Each delay tested patience, resolve, and narrative control. Evelyn refused to fill the silence. She stopped trying to anticipate outcomes and focused instead on what remained within reach. She attended meetings she was invited to, declined those framed as theater, spoke carefully, listened more than she spoke. Power, she was learning, did not always reside in motion. Sometimes it lived in restraint. Daniel felt the weight of waiting differently. For him, time was not abstract. It was measured in shifts, in school pickups, in homework completed at the kitchen table while pasta boiled on the stove. Life continued because it had to, regardless of investigations or board politics. Still, the strain seeped in. He noticed it when he double-checked the locks at night, when he scanned faces a little longer than necessary on the walk to Matteo's school, when unfamiliar cars, parked too long on their street, caught his attention. He told himself it was caution, but he knew it was fear. One evening, after Matteo was asleep, Daniel sat alone at the table with his notebook open but untouched. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, timelines, names, arrows connecting events that now felt distant. The patterns were clear. The outcome was not. He closed the notebook and rubbed his hands together slowly, grounding himself in the physical sensation. Sophia's voice drifted into his thoughts, unbidden. "You don't stop being afraid," she used to say. "You just decide what's worth it." Daniel exhaled. He had decided. 2. The next development came quietly, almost politely. Evelyn received a request from the regulator for a follow-up interview. This time not about finances or governance, but about culture. "How would you describe the environment your leadership created?" the request asked. Evelyn read it twice. This was new territory. The interview took place in a smaller room than before. No long table, no recording equipment in plain sight. Just two regulators, a notepad, and time. They asked her about expectations, about accountability, about how dissent was handled under her leadership. Evelyn answered honestly. "I believed clarity prevented chaos," she said. "But I underestimated how silence can hide beneath clarity." One of the regulators leaned forward. "And now I believe transparency is meaningless without courage," Evelyn replied. "People need to feel safe telling the truth before they can act on it." The room went quiet. When the interview ended, neither regulator offered reassurance or warning. But as Evelyn stood to leave, one of them spoke. "This process isn't just about outcomes," he said. "It's about precedent." Evelyn nodded. "Then let it be a good one." The consequences of that interview rippled outward faster than she expected. Within days, senior leaders began requesting one-on-one meetings, not to defend themselves, but to align. Conversations shifted from survival to sustainability. Questions changed from mass, "What will happen to us?" to "What should happen next?" to Evelyn noticed it in tone rather than content. The fear was thinning, not gone, but thinning. Daniel noticed it too, in an unexpected place. A supervisor approached him near the end of his shift, not with suspicion, but with something close to respect. "You've been handling this well," the man said awkwardly. Daniel nodded. "I'm just doing my job." The supervisor hesitated. "That's not all you're doing." Daniel met his gaze steadily. "It's all I'm responsible for." The man nodded once and walked away. Daniel stood there for a moment, struck by the realization that perception was shifting. Not because he demanded it, but because he hadn't retreated. 2. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday morning. Evelyn was in her office when legal counsel called, voice low but unmistakably energized. "They're preparing findings," he said. "Preliminary." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. "Which direction?" "There are concerns," he replied. "But not about you." Her pulse slowed. "About the board." "Yes." The call ended with no further detail. Evelyn sat still, hands folded neatly in her lap. This was it. Not resolution, but recognition. She did not celebrate. She did not call anyone. She simply sat and allowed the truth to settle into her bones. That night, she went to Daniel's apartment without warning. He opened the door to find her standing there, coat still on, expression unreadable. "It's turning," she said. He stepped aside immediately. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table, the familiar space grounding both of them. They're preparing findings. Evelyn continued. It's not final. But it's no longer about me. Daniel leaned back slowly. Then they miscalculated. Yes, she agreed. And they're realizing it. A long silence followed. Daniel broke it first. What happens if you're cleared? He asked. Evelyn considered the question carefully. Then I stay, she said, but differently. And if you're not? He pressed. She met his gaze. Then I leave knowing exactly why. Daniel nodded. Either way, you're free. The word echoed between them. Free. Mateo came into the room half asleep, rubbing his eyes. Why are you talking serious? He asked. Daniel smiled gently. Sometimes grown-ups do. Mateo frowned. Is everything okay? Evelyn knelt in front of him. Yes, she said softly. It will be. Mateo studied her for a moment, then nodded. Okay. He returned to bed without another word. Daniel watched him go, something heavy and tender tightening in his chest. He trusts you, he said quietly. Evelyn stood. I take that seriously. The days that followed felt unreal. People smiled more openly. Meetings ended with decisions instead of deferrals. The board grew quieter, their presence less dominant, less assured. Evelyn felt the shift like a tide turning beneath her feet. She did not push. She let it carry. One evening, standing on Daniel's balcony as rain fell softly around them, Evelyn spoke a thought she had been holding for weeks. I don't know what my life looks like after this, she said. Daniel leaned against the railing beside her. That's not fear. That's possibility. She smiled faintly. I'm not good with possibility. You're learning? He replied. She turned toward him, city lights blurred behind the rain. When this is over, she said, I don't want to go back to who I was. Daniel met her gaze steadily. Then don't. The simplicity of the answer struck her harder than any strategy ever had. They stood there together, listening to the rain, aware that whatever came next would reshape not just careers but lives. The storm was not over. But the ground beneath them was finally solid, and for the first time since all of this began, the future did not feel like something to be defended. It felt like something waiting to be chosen. The preliminary findings were not released all at once. They arrived in pieces, fragments of truth surfacing through careful channels, each one changing the shape of the silence that followed. Evelyn learned quickly which leaks were accidental and which were intentional. Regulators did not rush conclusions, but they allowed just enough information to circulate to prevent the narrative from being controlled by those who had once mastered it. The board felt the shift before it became visible. Evelyn noticed it in the way invitations changed. Meetings that had once been mandatory were now framed as optional. Conversations that used to happen behind closed doors began including observers. Emails grew longer, more cautious, their language padded with references to policy and precedent. Fear, she realized, made people verbose. She remained steady. Each morning she arrived early, not to assert presence but to observe. The building was different now. Not friendlier, just more honest. The quiet corridors carried less tension, as if the walls themselves were relieved to stop holding secrets. Her legal counsel briefed her midweek. They're focusing on procedural manipulation, he said. Influence exerted without documentation. Authority rerouted informally. Evelyn nodded. That aligns with what we saw. The findings won't absolve everyone, he continued, but they won't implicate you. She closed her eyes briefly. And the board? He hesitated. Some members are exposed. Others are compromised by association. Meaning, she asked. Meaning the structure itself will change, he said, regardless of who stays. When the call ended, Evelyn sat quietly for a long moment. Change had always been her goal. She just hadn't expected it to come at this cost. Daniel felt the weighting lift in subtle ways. The neighborhood felt lighter, not safer, just less watched. He noticed it when he walked Mateo to school and no unfamiliar cars lingered at the corner. When his phone stopped buzzing with unknown numbers that never left messages. Mateo noticed it too. You're smiling more, he said one morning, swinging his backpack with exaggerated enthusiasm. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Am I? Mateo nodded seriously. Your face does the soft thing. Daniel laughed and ruffled his hair. That's good feedback. Still, Daniel didn't let his guard down. He had lived too long knowing that relief was not the same as resolution. One evening, while studying at the kitchen table, he received an email from his former professor, the one who had encouraged him years ago to continue his studies before life had narrowed his options. I've been following the news, the email read. I want you to know I'm proud of the way you handled this. If you ever want to revisit the path you left, my door is open. Daniel stared at the screen for a long time. Paths, he had learned, did not close forever. They just waited. The board's fracture became visible the following Friday. 2 members resigned within hours of each other. No statements. No explanations. Just formal notices filed quietly and efficiently, like people leaving a building they knew would not welcome them back. The news reached Evelyn during a strategy meeting. Someone slid their phone across the table, the resignation notices already circulating internally. Evelyn read them without expression, then handed the phone back. Let's continue, she said calmly. The meeting did. That, more than the resignations themselves, sent a message. Daniel saw the news later that night while folding laundry. He didn't react immediately. When Evelyn arrived, he simply said, "They're stepping away." "Yes," she replied. "Before they're pushed." He nodded. "That means the findings are solid." "Wes." "And you?" he asked. She paused. "I'm still here." The formal release came the following week, redacted, measured. Unavoidable. The report outlined failures in oversight, misuse of informal authority, and deliberate obfuscation of accountability. It praised cooperation from executive leadership and recommended structural reform, including changes to board composition and governance controls. Evelyn read it alone in her office. She did not feel victorious. She felt clear. This was not an ending. It was a reset. When she left the building that evening, cameras waited outside. This time, she stopped. Not for long. "I'm proud of the people who chose transparency when it mattered," she said calmly. "The company will move forward with integrity. That's my only focus." No mention of the board. No personal defense. Just direction. Daniel watched the clip later, Mateo sitting beside him on the couch. "That's you," Mateo said proudly. Daniel smiled. "That's her." The aftermath unfolded unevenly. Some executives stayed. Others left quietly. New interim members were appointed. Committees restructured. Policies rewritten. Evelyn was asked, formally, this time, whether she would remain as CEO. She took 2 days to answer. In that time, she walked the city with Daniel. Ate at places that didn't know her name. Sat in parks watching people live lives untouched by quarterly projections or governance failures. On the second evening, standing beneath a streetlight as rain misted the air, Daniel spoke first. "You don't owe anyone an explanation," he said. "Whatever you decide." Evelyn looked at him. "I owe myself one." She accepted the role with conditions. Independent oversight, transparent reporting, cleared boundaries of authority. The board agreed. They had no leverage left. Life did not immediately return to normal. It reshaped itself. Daniel returned to his routines with a lighter step, though he remained observant. He enrolled in a single evening course. Not a declaration, just a beginning. Mateo adjusted easily, as children did, absorbing change without dramatizing it. Evelyn learned to leave the office earlier, to let decisions be made without her, to trust systems rebuilt not around her, but around principle. One night, as rain traced slow paths down the windows, Daniel watched Evelyn reading on the couch. Her posture relaxed in a way he had never seen before. "You're different," he said. She looked up. "Better or worse?" "Truer," he replied. She smiled softly. The story did not end with applause. It settled into routine, into trust, into the quiet knowledge that something important had been defended, and something even more important had been discovered. Power could be challenged. Truth could be documented. And a life, once narrowed by fear, could widen again. Not through ambition, but through choice. The storm had passed. Not because it was defeated, but because it had revealed what needed to change. And between the rain-soaked streets and the ordinary mornings that followed, Evelyn and Daniel stepped into a future neither of them had planned. But both were finally ready to claim. The weeks after the report felt strangely quiet, not peaceful. Evelyn had learned not to confuse the two, but settled, as if the ground beneath her feet had finally stopped shifting. The company moved forward with deliberate care. Interim board members listened more than they spoke. Committees documented everything. Decisions slowed just enough to be thoughtful instead of reactive. For the first time since the storm began, Evelyn was no longer bracing for impact. She was choosing. Her days changed shape. She still arrived early, but she no longer stayed late out of habit. She delegated without guilt, trusted without hovering. The need to control every variable loosened its grip, replaced by something steadier: confidence without defensiveness. People noticed. Not all of them approved, but enough did that the culture began to bend. One afternoon, a mid-level manager stopped her in the hallway. "I wanted to thank you," the woman said quietly, "for making it safer to speak." Evelyn met her gaze. "Keep doing it," she replied. "That's how this lasts." Daniel's life expanded in small, careful increments. The evening class challenged him more than he expected. Not because the material was difficult, but because it reopened a part of himself he had set aside for survival. He studied after Matteo fell asleep, the apartment quiet except for the scratch of pen on paper and the occasional sigh of frustration. Evelyn sat nearby often, reading or working, offering silent companionship rather than instruction. "You don't have to stay up," he told her one night. "I want to," she replied simply. Matteo adjusted easily to their rhythm. He began including Evelyn in his routines, asking her to check his homework, to read an extra story before bed, to sit beside him at breakfast. He never asked what she meant to stay. Children, Evelyn learned, accepted presence as truth. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Matteo looked up from his drawing. "Are you going to live here forever?" he asked matter-of-factly. Daniel froze. Evelyn did not. "If you'd like me to," she said gently. Matteo nodded once, satisfied. "Okay." Daniel felt something in his chest loosen that he hadn't realized he'd been holding. 2. The offer came quietly. Not a promotion. Not a headline. A call from a foundation seeking leadership, ethical governance, corporate accountability, long-term reform. They wanted Evelyn's guidance, her name, her time. She listened carefully. Then she declined. Not because she couldn't do it, because she no longer needed to. Later that night, Daniel asked her about it. "Do you ever worry you're stepping back too much?" he asked. Evelyn considered the question honestly. "No," she said. "I'm stepping toward something else." He smiled. "That sounds like growth." She smiled back. "It feels like balance." Later, the seasons shifted. Rain gave way to clearer mornings. The city softened around the edges. Life settled into routines that felt earned rather than imposed. Evelyn moved out of her penthouse. Not dramatically, quietly. She chose a smaller place closer to Daniel's apartment at first. Then, eventually, she didn't leave at all. The transition was unspoken. It didn't need to be explained. One night, standing together on the balcony, Daniel spoke what had been circling between them for months. "I don't want this to be temporary," he said. Evelyn met his gaze, steady and sure. "Neither do I." He didn't propose. Not yet. Instead, he took her hand, warm, grounded, real. That was enough. The final closure came from the board. A formal apology, carefully worded, public. Evelyn read it once and closed the document. She felt no satisfaction, only distance. That chapter was done. 2 months later, on a quiet evening when rain returned in gentle sheets, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table watching Daniel help Matteo with homework. The scene was unremarkable, and that was the miracle of it. This ordinary, unguarded life, was something she had never believed she was allowed to want. Daniel caught her watching and smiled. "What?" he asked. She shook her head. "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. Power had not saved her. Control had not protected her. What had endured was truth, courage, and a man who refused to look away when it mattered most. Between raindrops and long nights, between loss and resilience, Evelyn Carter found something no boardroom had ever offered her. A life that didn't require armor. A love that didn't ask her to be smaller. And a future built not on fear, but on choice. The quiet that followed the upheaval did not arrive all at once. It settled gradually, like dust after demolition. Unnoticed at first, then impossible to ignore once everything stopped moving. Evelyn began to understand that silence no longer meant danger. It no longer signaled what was about to break. Sometimes, it simply meant nothing was demanding her attention. That realization unsettled her more than the chaos ever had. At work, the changes she had insisted on began to function without her constant supervision. Oversight committees met independently. Reports arrived with annotations already applied. Questions were asked before mistakes hardened into habits. For the first time in years, she was not the axis everything revolved around. And the company did not collapse. She walked the building more often now. Not with purpose, but with presence. She noticed the rhythm of the place, the way the lobby filled and emptied, the cadence of footsteps on different floors, the subtle signs of maintenance work done well enough that no one ever noticed it. She thought of Daniel, of how much labor went unseen until someone stopped doing it. One afternoon, she rode the elevator down with a junior analyst who looked startled to see her standing there without an assistant or phone pressed to her ear. "Good afternoon," the woman said nervously. "Good afternoon," Evelyn replied easily. The woman hesitated. "I just wanted to say thank you for how you handled everything." Evelyn met her gaze. "You don't need to thank me. Just do better than the system that failed you." The woman nodded, visibly relieved. Evelyn stepped out of the elevator feeling something unfamiliar light. To cut off Daniel's life expanded in ways that felt careful rather than ambitious. The evening course challenged him, not because the material was overwhelming, but because it forced him to re-engage parts of himself he had buried for survival. He studied after Mateo fell asleep, the apartment quiet except for the scratch of pen on paper and the low hum of the refrigerator. Sometimes he doubted himself. Sometimes he felt old sitting among younger students with fewer interruptions in their lives. But he kept going, not to reclaim who he used to be, to become who he was now. Mateo watched him from the hallway one night, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Why do you work after work?" he asked. Daniel smiled. "So I can do better work later." Mateo considered this seriously. "That makes sense." Evelyn overheard the exchange from the kitchen, folding laundry that no longer separated cleanly into hers and of theirs. The realization caught her off guard. At some point, she had stopped packing a bag. She had simply stayed. To the conversation they had avoided finally arrived on an ordinary evening. No raised voices. No dramatic timing. Daniel was washing dishes. Evelyn was folding towels, methodically aligning edges the way she always did when thinking. "This can't stay undefined forever," Daniel said gently, without turning around. Evelyn paused, towel in her hands. "I know," she said. He dried his hands slowly, giving the moment the care it deserved. "I don't need certainty. I need clarity." She met his gaze. "So do I." They sat at the table, the apartment dim and warm around them. "I've lived most of my life in contingencies," Evelyn said quietly. "Exit plans, safeguards, worst-case scenarios." Daniel nodded. "I've lived in immediacy. What needs to be done right now?" She smiled faintly. "Neither leaves much room for permanence." "No," he agreed. "But both teach responsibility." She looked at him then, not as a partner in crisis, not as a man who had helped her survive, but as someone offering her a future that did not require vigilance. "I want to stay," she said simply. "Not as an escape, as a choice." Daniel exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "That's all I needed to hear." They told Mateo the following weekend. Not formally, not as an announcement. They were making breakfast together, pancakes slightly burned, laughter easy, when Mateo looked between them and frowned thoughtfully. "You're here a lot," he observed. "Yes," Evelyn said carefully. Mateo tilted his head. "Is that forever or just now?" Daniel waited. So did Evelyn. "If you want me to be," she said softly, "I'd like it to be forever." Mateo studied her face with the seriousness only children could manage. Then he nodded. Okay. And that was that. No celebration, no fear, just acceptance. Till life rearranged itself quietly after that. Evelyn's clothes filled the closet a little more each week. Her books appeared on the shelves. A spare toothbrush became unnecessary. She stopped referring to Daniel's apartment as his. Daniel stopped bracing for departure. Mateo adjusted as if this had always been the plan. One evening, Evelyn returned home later than expected, rain clinging lightly to her coat. Daniel looked up from the couch. "Long day?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, "but not heavy." She realized that was new. The last loose thread arrived without drama. A former board member requested a meeting. Evelyn agreed, on her terms. Public place. Recorded agenda. No expectation of reconciliation. The man apologized. Not perfectly, but honestly. Evelyn accepted it without reopening wounds. Closure, she realized, did not require absolution. It required acknowledgement. When she returned home, Daniel was helping Mateo with homework, patience evident in every small correction. She watched from the doorway, heart unexpectedly full. This ordinary moment, was something she had never believed was meant for her. Later, as rain fell softly against the windows, Daniel spoke quietly. "You know you're already family, right?" Evelyn nodded. "I know." And for the first time in her life, that word did not feel like a responsibility. It felt like shelter. Power had not protected her. Control had not saved her. What endured was truth, steadiness, and a man who chose integrity over fear, and a child who trusted her enough to let her stay. Outside, the rain continued its patient rhythm. Inside, a life settled into place. Not dramatic, not perfect, but chosen. And that made all the difference. Stability, Evelyn learned, did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, almost suspiciously, like a pause in the middle of a song where you waited for the next note, and then realized the silence itself was part of the music. Days began to blur into something gentler than routine. Not predictable, exactly, but dependable. Evelyn woke up without immediately scanning her mind for threats. Daniel moved through mornings without the constant low-level tension that had once accompanied every unknown phone call. Mateo went to school secure in the assumption that the people who tucked him in at night would still be there in the morning. That assumption felt sacred. At work, Evelyn's leadership entered a new phase, one that surprised even her. She spoke less in meetings and listened more. When disagreements surfaced, she allowed them space instead of resolving them instantly. Watching others step forward without being summoned gave her a strange sense of pride. She was no longer the center. She was the anchor. One afternoon during a governance review session, a board member, new, carefully vetted, turned to her and said, "You've built something that works even without you in the room." Evelyn smiled. That was the point. The words felt truer than she had expected. To Daniel's evenings became moments of quiet recalibration. He no longer studied as if time were borrowed. He studied as if it belonged to him again. Concepts that once felt distant returned with surprising clarity, and the confidence that followed was steady rather than arrogant. Mateo liked to sit nearby, sometimes pretending to read his own book, sometimes asking questions he didn't yet understand. "Why do numbers matter so much?" Mateo asked one night. Daniel thought for a moment. "They tell stories." Mateo frowned. "But stories have people." Daniel smiled. "Exactly." Evelyn listened from the kitchen, struck by the simplicity of it. Stories always had people. Somewhere along the way, she had forgotten that. The outside world tried, once more, to intrude. A business publication reached out for a follow-up interview. A podcast host requested commentary on ethical leadership. A conference extended an invitation that would have required travel, spotlight, and visibility. Evelyn declined all of them. Not out of fear, out of choice. Daniel noticed her turning down the invitations one by one. "Any regrets?" he asked one evening. She shook her head. "I don't need to narrate my life to validate it." He smiled. "That sounds like freedom." "It feels like it," she replied. The question of permanence surfaced again, not as uncertainty, but as logistics. Daniel's lease was nearing renewal. Evelyn's apartment stood empty more often than not, its sleek quiet now feeling foreign and unnecessary. They talked about it over dinner, Matteo pushing peas around his plate with intense focus. "Do we need to decide something?" Daniel asked gently. Evelyn looked around the table, the mismatched chairs, the faint hum of the city outside, the child who now assumed her presence without question. "I think we already have," she said. They didn't frame it as moving in. They framed it as staying. That weekend, they did something neither of them had planned. They took a day off. No errands, no obligations, no contingency planning. They walked through a park not far from the apartment, Matteo racing ahead with unfiltered enthusiasm. Evelyn sat on a bench watching Daniel jog clumsily after him, laughter unrestrained. The scene felt almost surreal. "This is what people mean," she said quietly. Daniel sat beside her. "Mean by what?" "By having a life," she replied. He nudged her shoulder lightly. "You always had one. You just didn't stop long enough to see it." She leaned into him, letting the moment exist without trying to preserve it. That night, after Matteo fell asleep, Evelyn sat alone at the table, reviewing a document she hadn't expected to see again. A personal development plan, one she had written years ago, full of ambitions, metrics, timelines. She read it slowly, recognizing the woman who had written it, and the fear that had driven every line. Daniel noticed the look on her face. "What's that?" he asked. "A version of me that thought success was safety," she replied. He glanced at the pages. Was she wrong? "No," Evelyn said. "Just incomplete." She closed the document and slid it into a drawer she didn't lock. The final internal ripple arrived quietly. An email from the regulator confirmed the review was officially closed. No further action. No lingering conditions. The language was neutral. The relief was not. Evelyn sat with the message open for a long time, absorbing what it meant. Not just professionally, but personally. This chapter was done, not paused, finished. She told Daniel that night. He didn't celebrate. He simply nodded, as if he had expected it all along. "I'm proud of you," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "For not choosing the easy version of yourself," he replied. Her throat tightened. Too late that night, as rain returned softly, gentler now, familiar, Evelyn stood at the window, watching the city lights blur. Daniel joined her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm letting go," she replied. Of fear, of armor, of the need to be untouchable. She turned toward him. "I don't know what comes next," she said. Daniel smiled. "That's okay. Neither do I." They stood together in the quiet, the storm outside reduced to background rhythm. For the first time in her life, Evelyn did not feel the need to plan beyond the moment. She had chosen truth over control, presence over performance, love over isolation, and whatever remained ahead, however uncertain, would be faced not as a test to survive, but as a life to live. Between raindrops, between endings and beginnings, the future waited. And this time, she was ready. The end of the review did not feel like a finish line. It felt like a door closing quietly behind them. No echo, no announcement. Just the certainty that whatever followed would not be shaped by the past anymore. Evelyn noticed the change first in herself. She stopped rehearsing conversations that never happened. Stopped bracing before opening emails. Stopped measuring her worth against outcomes that had nothing to do with who she was when the day ended. The instinct to armor herself still flickered now and then, but it no longer governed her. At work, the company entered a period of reconstruction that was deliberate rather than reactive. New board members took their seats with humility instead of entitlement. Committees asked uncomfortable questions and stayed with the answers long enough to matter. Systems were redesigned not to prevent blame, but to invite responsibility. Evelyn participated without dominating. She advised without controlling. She left meetings early sometimes, trusting that the room could hold itself. That trust changed everything. One afternoon, a young director approached her after a session. "You don't speak much anymore," the woman said carefully. "But when you do, people listen more." Evelyn smiled. "That's because I finally learned when silence is stronger." Daniel felt the closure land differently. For him, the absence of threat did not immediately translate into peace. His body had learned vigilance too well. It took time for the constant alertness to ease, for the late, night listening for unfamiliar sounds to fade. But slowly, it did. He slept deeper, laughed more easily, let himself imagine futures that extended further than the next semester or the next paycheck. One evening, as he worked through an assignment at the table, Mateo sat beside him, legs swinging. "What happens after you finish school?" Mateo asked. Daniel paused. "What do you think?" What? Mateo shrugged. "You do something you like more." Daniel smiled. "That sounds like a good plan." Evelyn watched from the kitchen, heart full in a way that startled her. This was the kind of success no board could measure. Testing the question of permanence returned again, this time without hesitation. Evelyn's penthouse lease reached its final month. The space had become a museum of her former life, pristine, untouched, echoing. She walked through it, one last time, fingers trailing along surfaces that once represented arrival. Now they felt unnecessary. She boxed what mattered, gave away what didn't. There was no grief in it, only clarity. When she brought the final box to Daniel's apartment, Mateo helped carry it in with exaggerated effort. "Is this the last one?" he asked. "Yes," Evelyn said. Mateo grinned. "Good, we're out of room." Daniel laughed softly, watching the moment settle. That night, Evelyn lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the apartment. The distant traffic, the creak of the floor, the steady breathing of a household at rest. For the first time, she slept without dreaming of work. The world did not stop offering her visibility. Invitations continued to arrive. Panels, awards, speaking engagements framed as opportunities to own the narrative. Evelyn declined most of them. She accepted one. A small, closed-door session with early career professionals navigating ethical leadership for the first time. No cameras, no press. Just conversation. She spoke honestly. About fear, about compromise, about the cost of choosing integrity when it mattered least and most. Afterward, a young woman approached her, eyes bright. "I didn't know you could survive that and still have a life," she said. Evelyn smiled. "You can, but you have to decide what life means before someone else defines it for you." Daniel's professor invited him to apply for a research assistant position. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't promise immediate reward, but it offered growth. Daniel accepted, not because he needed the validation, because he wanted the challenge. Evelyn celebrated quietly. Home, cooked dinner, Mateo insisting on dessert first. "You're doing big things," Mateo said proudly. Daniel shook his head. "I'm doing honest things." Mateo considered this. "Those are better." One evening, rain returned heavier than usual, drumming against the windows with familiar insistence. Evelyn stood watching it, memories rising unbidden. The first night she had come here unsure, armored, exhausted. The nights she had almost walked away to protect everyone but herself. Daniel joined her, standing close. "You're thinking about the beginning," he said. "Yes," she replied. "About how close I came to choosing fear." He met her gaze. "And how you didn't." She turned toward him fully. "I don't want to waste this," she said quietly. Daniel took her hands. "Then don't." There was no proposal, no dramatic declaration, just certainty. The next morning, Evelyn woke early and wrote something she had never allowed herself before. Not a strategy, not a contingency, a list. Things that mattered. It was short. Mateo, integrity, time, peace. She folded the paper and placed it in her wallet, not as a reminder, but as a promise. As summer edged closer, life found a rhythm that felt earned rather than imposed. Mateo grew louder, happier. Daniel grew surer, steadier. Evelyn grew softer without becoming smaller. The storm that had once defined everything now felt distant, remembered, not relived. Between raindrops and ordinary mornings, between endings and choices freely made, they built something quiet and unremarkable, which Evelyn finally understood was the most extraordinary thing of all. And still, one final truth waited, gentle, inevitable, and full of hope. Not an ending, but a beginning they no longer feared. The realization arrived on a morning so ordinary that Evelyn almost missed it. She woke before the alarm, the room still dim, the city outside holding its breath between night and day. Daniel lay beside her, one arm draped loosely across her waist, his breathing slow and even. From the other room came the faint sound of Matteo turning in his sleep. Nothing was wrong. Nothing was urgent. Nothing needed fixing. The absence of crisis felt unfamiliar, and then, unexpectedly comforting. Evelyn lay still for a long moment, listening to the sounds of a life she had not planned but had chosen. The refrigerator hummed softly. A car passed somewhere below. Rain tapped lightly against the window, more habit than storm now. This was it, she realized, not the peak. Not the reward. The middle, where life actually happened. Later that morning, they sat together at the kitchen table, breakfast unfolding in its usual imperfect way. Matteo complained about cereal being soggy. Daniel burned the toast slightly. Evelyn laughed, an easy sound that surprised even her. "You're smiling again," Daniel said, handing her a plate. "I never stopped," she replied. "I just forgot how it felt." Matteo looked between them. Did something good happen? Daniel considered. Something right did. Matteo nodded solemnly as if that explained everything. The company announced the final governance changes that afternoon, not with fanfare, with documentation. Evelyn read through the release once, then forwarded it through her leadership team with a brief note. This is what accountability looks like. Let's keep it this way." Their responses came back quickly. Affirmation, resolve, relief. No praise, no panic. Exactly as it should be. She closed her laptop and left the office early. No one questioned it. Daniel received his first assignment as a research assistant that same day. The work was meticulous, demanding, quietly challenging. He spread the materials across the table that evening, Matteo coloring nearby, Evelyn reviewing notes of her own. "This is hard," Daniel said thoughtfully. Evelyn smiled. "That's how you know it matters." He nodded, the satisfaction of effort settling into something steady. That weekend, they did something small but significant. They visited Sophia's grave. It was the first time Evelyn had gone with them. Daniel hadn't asked her to. She hadn't offered. But that morning, as rain threatened but never fully arrived, she simply said, "I'd like to come." The cemetery was quiet, the grass still damp from earlier showers. Matteo ran ahead, then slowed when Daniel called his name gently. They stood together before the marker. The world hushed around them. Daniel knelt, brushing away a few fallen leaves. Matteo placed a small stone on top, as he always did. "She would have liked you," Daniel said softly, without looking at Evelyn. Evelyn's throat tightened. "I would have liked her." Daniel looked up then, meeting her gaze. There was no sadness sharp enough to wound, only memory, honored and intact. "This life," he said quietly, "doesn't replace what came before." "I know," Evelyn replied. "It just continues it." They stood there a moment longer, rain finally giving up and retreating into mist. That night, something shifted again. Gentler, deeper. Daniel and Evelyn sat on the couch, Matteo asleep, the apartment wrapped in quiet. "I've been thinking," Daniel said slowly. "About what comes next." Evelyn turned toward him. "Tell me." "I don't want to keep waiting for the right moment," he said. "I want to build something on purpose." Her pulse steadied, not racing, not afraid. "What does that look like to you?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "It looks like waking up together without wondering if it's temporary." She took his hand. "Then we want the same thing." There was no ring, no speech, just understanding. The following week, Evelyn made one final decision tied to her old life. She stepped down from 2 boards that had once defined her reach and influence. Not out of resentment, but out of alignment. The time they demanded no longer matched the life she was building. She was asked why. Her answer was simple. "Because I have enough now." The words surprised people. They did not surprise her. 2. Matteo noticed the change in his own way. "Are you my stepmom now?" he asked one night, blunt as only a child could be. Evelyn didn't rush the answer. "If you want me to be someday," she said carefully, "I'd be honored." Matteo thought about it, then grinned. "Okay, but you still have to help with math." She laughed, tears stinging her eyes. "Deal." Daniel watched the exchange, emotion passing over his face unguarded. That night, when the apartment finally went quiet, he spoke. "You know, he said softly. "You didn't save us." Evelyn looked at him. "I never thought I did. You stood with us," he corrected. "That's different." She leaned into him, the truth of it settling warm and sure. As autumn approached, life moved forward in gentle increments. School projects, deadlines, meetings that mattered and ones that didn't. Evenings filled with conversation instead of contingency planning. The storm that had once defined everything was now a story they told quietly, when it mattered. Not as trauma, as proof. Proof that power could be challenged, that integrity could outlast fear, that love did not weaken ambition, it refined it. And as rain returned one evening, steady and familiar, Evelyn stood at the window, Daniel beside her, Matteo laughing in the next room. Between raindrops and ordinary moments, between who she had been and who she had chosen to become, Evelyn understood something at last. The bravest thing she had ever done was not standing alone. It was staying. One final chapter remained. Not to resolve conflict, but to name the life they had built, fully, finally, and without fear. The life they built did not arrive with certainty. It arrived with intention. On a quiet morning thick with mist, Evelyn stood at the kitchen window watching Daniel tie Matteo's shoelaces. One loop too loose, corrected patiently, hands steady. The moment was unremarkable in every way that mattered. This was not a victory lap. It was a continuation. Evelyn had spent years believing that endings came with clarity and beginnings with fear. What she learned instead was that the two often arrived together, quietly, indistinguishable from one another, asking only to be lived rather than analyzed. Work found its rightful place again, not as identity, as contribution. Evelyn remained CEO, but the title no longer defined her posture or her peace. She left the office at reasonable hours, missed a meeting to attend a school event without apology. Delegated not as strategy but as trust. The company stabilized. Not because she controlled it, but because she no longer needed to. Daniel's world widened in parallel. His studies progressed steadily, fueled not by desperation but by curiosity. He spoke in class with the same measured clarity he brought to everything else. Never loud, never tentative. Professors noticed. Opportunities emerged. He chose carefully. Not every door needed to be opened. Matteo flourished. Children always knew when adults were finally telling the truth with their lives. His laughter came easier. His questions grew bolder. He stopped watching the door when night fell. Home, to him, was no longer fragile. It was dependable. One evening, rain returned. Not dramatic, just steady, tapping against the windows as if reminding them of where this story had begun. They sat together on the couch, Matteo asleep in the next room, the apartment warm and familiar around them. "I used to think love was another variable to manage," Evelyn said quietly. "Something that complicated everything." Daniel smiled, faintly. And now I think it's what made everything else honest," she replied. He took her hand, not tightly, not possessively, just present. Weeks later, they stood in a small courtroom. Not for conflict, not for defense, but for commitment. No audience, no spectacle, just signatures, promises spoken plainly, and a child holding Daniel's hand while watching Evelyn with unwavering trust. Matteo beamed when it was done. "So that means forever?" he asked. Daniel crouched to his level. "That means we keep choosing each other." Matteo nodded, satisfied. "That's better." Evelyn felt tears gather, not from fear, not from relief, but from recognition. This was the life she had once believed was not meant for her. Not because she wasn't worthy, but because she hadn't known how to stop surviving long enough to live. Later that night, rain softened into drizzle, and the city hummed quietly beyond the windows. Evelyn stood between Daniel and Matteo, arms around both. The future no longer something she guarded against. She didn't need armor anymore. She had truth. She had courage. She had love that didn't ask her to be smaller, quieter, or less powerful, only more present. Between raindrops and ordinary mornings, between loss and choice, between who she had been and who she had become, Evelyn Carter found what no boardroom, no title, no victory had ever given her. A home that didn't disappear when the storm arrived. A partner who stood without needing to lead. A child who trusted her enough to call her family. And a life built not on fear of falling, but on the certainty that she would never fall alone. This was not the end. It was the place she finally learned to stay.